Stop what you are doing for a moment and give this message your full attention. Put both feet on the floor, let the noise around you fall behind you, and listen carefully. This is not a message about something far away from your life. It is about a moment that can arrive so quietly that even a person who has prayed for it for years can stand inside it and fail to recognize what has changed. The algorithm may have placed these words in front of you, but the reason you are still listening is deeper than a screen. Something in you noticed the weight of this before your mind could explain it. You have felt a strange pressure around time lately, as if one chapter has already ended, even though the next one has not fully shown its face. That feeling matters, because the most important threshold of your life may not announce itself with noise. God does not always mark a turning point with thunder. Sometimes the first sign is that the old things stop gripping you the way they once did. A conversation that would have disturbed you for days suddenly passes through without taking your peace. A person whose approval once felt necessary begins to lose power over your decisions. You notice it, but because nothing dramatic happened, you almost dismiss it. Do not dismiss it. There are seasons when the absence of chaos is itself a message. The old cycle can become quiet before the new assignment becomes visible, and that quiet can feel unfamiliar to someone who has spent years surviving one battle after another. You may call it emptiness at first, but heaven may be creating space around something that cannot enter, while every old voice still has access to you. This is where many chosen ones become confused. You expected the answer to feel like relief, yet the first thing you felt was distance. You expected clarity, yet certain plans that once excited you suddenly became difficult to care about. You expected movement, yet your spirit began pulling you away from people, habits, and rooms that once felt normal. You thought something was being taken, when in truth, something may have stopped belonging to the version of you that is being formed. Think about the last several days without forcing an answer. Have you caught yourself staring at your phone and feeling no desire to explain yourself to someone who used to control your emotions? Have you entered a familiar place and sensed, almost immediately, that you had already outgrown the atmosphere? Have you woken before the rest of the world and felt alert in a way that did not match the hour? These small changes can look unrelated, but they may be moving around the same center. And here is the first thing I need you to hold. The moment that changes a life is not always the moment something arrives. Sometimes it is the moment you finally stop reaching backward for what God has already finished separating from you. That is why this message is not asking you to search for a sign in the sky. It is asking you to notice what no longer has the authority to pull you out of alignment. You are not being asked to become careless or detached from reality. You are being asked to observe the difference between peace and numbness, between silence and abandonment, between a closed door and a completed assignment. The watchman in you must learn that not every quiet place is empty. Some quiet places are protected ground. Some doors become still because there is nothing left behind them that can carry you forward. If you are a spiritual warrior, this may feel strange because battle has trained your attention to look for impact. You know how to recognize resistance, tension, betrayal, pressure, and the sudden appearance of opposition. But what happens when resistance decreases? What happens when the people who once provoked you no longer reach the same place inside you? What happens when the battlefield becomes quiet before you have received a map of the next territory? That is one of the hidden tests of transition. A person can become so familiar with struggle that peace feels suspicious. A person can spend so long watching for what might go wrong that an open space feels more dangerous than a locked door. This does not mean you are weak. It means your spirit has learned to guard what mattered, and now that same vigilance must learn a new language. Chosen one, there is a difference between being delayed and being repositioned. Delay feels like endless repetition with no inner change. Repositioning often begins with changes inside you before anything outside you confirms them. Your appetite changes. Your tolerance changes. Your conversations change. The external evidence may still look almost identical, but the person standing inside the evidence is no longer the same. You may have noticed that old explanations no longer satisfy you. You can hear advice that once sounded wise and feel that it no longer reaches the place where your next decision is being formed. You can sit among familiar people and realize that you are no longer asking the questions they are asking. This does not make you superior to them. It means your assignment may be requiring a level of discernment that cannot be borrowed from the crowd. That is why the next part of your life cannot be entered by noise alone. The loudest option is not automatically the right one. The opportunity that creates the fastest emotional reaction is not automatically the appointed one. And this is where the warning becomes serious, because the wrong door can sometimes look more exciting than the right one. Hold that thought. There will come a point in this message when we return to the difference between a door that flatters your old pattern and a door that matches the person God has been forming in secret. That difference is subtle. It may be the reason one opportunity feels urgent while another feels almost strangely calm. If you miss that distinction, you can mistake intensity for confirmation. You have already lived through enough to know that not every invitation deserves your yes. Not every return deserves your attention. Not every sudden connection deserves access to the part of you that took years to rebuild. The chosen one is not called to respond to everything that knocks. The watchman is called to know what belongs at the gate. For some of you, the clearest evidence of this transition is not what entered your life, but what stopped disturbing your sleep. A memory can still exist without ruling the room. A name can still appear without changing your breathing. A disappointment can still be true without becoming the lens through which you see tomorrow. When that shift happens quietly, it is easy to overlook how much authority has returned to you. And there is another sign. You may feel unusually unwilling to force what used to require constant effort. You are not giving up. You are becoming less willing to drag what has no life in it. There is a difference. There is a difference. A destiny carrier cannot spend every ounce of attention convincing dead situations to become alive again. Listen closely here, because this is where the message begins to turn. The thing you have been waiting for may not first appear as a reward. It may appear as a choice that exposes whether you still need the old version of yourself to feel safe. The moment can look ordinary from the outside while carrying enormous spiritual weight on the inside. That is why you have felt time differently. There are moments when a week passes like a day. Then one conversation feels as if everything slowed down around it. One sentence stays with you longer than an entire month of noise. One unexpected piece feels more important than 10 dramatic signs. Your spirit is not always measuring importance by volume. You are learning to recognize weight. The spiritual warrior in you has already learned endurance. The watchman in you is now learning timing. Those are not the same skill. Endurance keeps you standing when the road is long, but timing teaches you when standing still has completed its purpose and movement has become obedience. And this is the part that cannot be rushed. If God has been removing your dependence on constant reassurance, then the next instruction may arrive without the emotional fireworks you once expected. If God has been teaching you to hear beneath the noise, then the next opening may be recognized by peace, before it is confirmed by circumstances. That is why the quiet around you deserves more attention than you have been giving it. You may be asking, if this moment is so important, why would it be hidden inside something so subtle? Because anything that can only be recognized through discernment cannot be possessed by imitation. A crowd can copy behavior. A counterfeit can copy language. But it cannot manufacture the inner knowing that comes when preparation and timing finally meet. This is not the reveal yet. There is still a piece missing, and without that piece, the entire warning would sound like another command to chase every new possibility. That is not what this is. Before you can recognize the once-in-a-lifetime moment, you need to understand why the season before it often feels like loss, silence, and delay. So look again at what has changed in you before you look at what has changed around you. Notice what no longer provokes the old reaction. Notice what you no longer feel compelled to defend. Notice where your energy withdraws without anger and where your peace remains, even when the answer is incomplete. These are not final conclusions, but they are clues. The near miss is this. You can be so focused on waiting for the door to open that you fail to notice the lock has already changed. You can keep praying for movement while standing in a place where the mechanism of your old captivity no longer works the way it used to. And if you keep measuring the future by the pressure of the past, you may not recognize freedom when it first arrives quietly. Chosen one, what you are facing is not merely a question of whether something is coming. The deeper question is whether you will recognize it before the old reflex inside you names it too small, too calm, too unfamiliar, or too late. The answer to that question is connected to everything that follows. And before we name the moment itself, we have to understand why heaven often lets the room become quiet first. Chosen one, the quiet you have been noticing is not empty. It has a pattern to it, and the pattern becomes visible when you stop looking only for dramatic signs. Think about how many things have changed without an announcement. Your reactions are different, your tolerance is different, and even the people who once knew exactly how to pull you into confusion may be discovering that the old access no longer works. One of the first signs is almost too small to respect. You begin waking with a thought that feels complete before you have had time to build it. You enter a room and understand the atmosphere before anyone tells you what happened. You hear a familiar explanation, and something inside you quietly says that it is no longer enough. None of these moments look like a breakthrough, yet together they can reveal that your discernment is changing before your circumstances do. You may also notice that certain environments exhaust you faster than they used to. This is not permission to judge the people inside them. It is an invitation to notice what your spirit now struggles to remain connected to. What once felt normal can suddenly feel crowded, repetitive, or strangely heavy, because the inner standard by which you recognize alignment is no longer where it was. And there is a more surprising sign. Things that used to make you afraid of losing people may now make you more afraid of losing yourself. The old version of you would have rushed to repair every silence, explain every boundary, and soften every truth until nobody felt uncomfortable. Now you can feel the impulse to do it, but another part of you remains still. That stillness is important. Here is the first question I want to leave open for you. Why would several changes that seem completely unrelated begin appearing at the same time? Why would your sleep, your attention, your emotional reactions, and your tolerance for certain patterns all begin shifting together? What if these are not separate problems at all, but different signals coming from the same deeper transition? A chosen one often notices the shift before having language for it. That is why you can feel something is different and still struggle to explain it to people who ask what is going on. You may say that you are tired, but tired is not the whole truth. You may say that you need space, but space is not the whole truth either. The deeper reality is that some part of you is beginning to reject an arrangement that the rest of your life has not yet caught up with. This is where the loneliness can become intense. You are not necessarily alone because nobody cares. Sometimes you feel alone because the version of you being formed can no longer fully participate in conversations designed for the version you are leaving. That gap can make a crowded table feel strangely distant because your body is present while your attention has already started moving toward another level of responsibility. Do not turn that into superiority. The purpose is not to believe that you are above other people. The purpose is to understand why constant agreement can become impossible when discernment is growing. A watchman is not valuable because the watchman stands higher than everyone else. A watchman is valuable because the watchman notices movement while it is still far enough away to prepare for. You may have experienced this recently in a conversation. Someone said something ordinary, but you heard the motive beneath the words before you could prove it. You did not need to accuse them or expose anything. You simply understood that the old way of responding would take you back into a pattern you had already paid a high price to leave. That quiet recognition is more powerful than the dramatic confrontation you might once have chosen. Another sign is your relationship with urgency. Things that used to force an immediate response may no longer command you so easily. A message can arrive, and you do not feel obligated to answer from panic. An opportunity can appear, and instead of being overwhelmed by the fear of losing it, you feel the need to observe it. This does not mean every pause is divine, but it does mean your nervous habit of calling everything urgent may be losing authority. And that matters because counterfeit doors often depend on urgency. They need you to move before you can see clearly. They need you to confuse pressure with confirmation and speed with favor. The right door does not always feel slow, but it does not need your fear in order to remain real. Chosen one, remember that line because we are going to return to it later. There is a difference between something that activates your old hunger for validation and something that aligns with the person you have become. At first, both can look like opportunity. Both can arrive with flattering words, unexpected access, or the promise of immediate relief. The distinction only becomes obvious when you recognize what each one is asking you to become in order to enter. This is why the season before a major transition often contains strange losses of interest. You can wake up and realize that a goal you chased for years no longer carries the same emotional charge. You can finally receive attention from someone whose attention once felt essential and discover that it does not satisfy you. You can stand close to something you once begged for and sense that receiving it now would take you backward. That can feel disorienting because the mind expects desire to be permanent. It assumes that if you wanted something deeply, you must continue wanting it simply because time has passed. But preparation can change the person doing the wanting. And when the person changes, an old answer can become the wrong answer, even if it arrives exactly as requested. This is one reason spiritual timing is difficult to recognize. You may spend years thinking that the promise is one specific outcome, when the deeper work has been reshaping your capacity to recognize what actually belongs to you. The external symbol may have been useful because it kept you moving, but eventually the symbol has to give way to discernment. Otherwise, you may grab the first thing that resembles the picture and miss the substance that the picture was trying to teach you to expect. There is another marker that deserves attention. You may be remembering earlier versions of yourself with unusual clarity, a season from childhood, a forgotten talent, a way you used to create, imagine, learn, or notice things before life taught you to reduce yourself. These memories can surface without warning, and at first, they may feel like nostalgia. But sometimes they are more than nostalgia. Sometimes they remind you that your current limitations are not the full definition of your capacity. They point back to a version of your attention that was less divided, less burdened, less trained to expect interruption. And that raises a question we will not answer yet. What if part of this transition is not about becoming someone completely new, but recovering access to something that was present before the noise became normal? Keep that question with you. There is a reason I am bringing it forward now and not answering it immediately. Over the last several years, researchers have been studying a pattern in the human brain that touches and experience spiritually sensitive people often describe without having a precise name for it. It does not replace faith, and it does not explain away what is sacred. It simply raises a practical question about the condition of the mind that must recognize what the spirit is already sensing. I am not talking about a quick trick, a motivational slogan, or another demand to force yourself into focus. I am talking about a specific idea connected to the way different parts of the brain communicate and what happens when that communication becomes less integrated over time. We will come back to that later because it connects directly to something many chosen ones have mistaken for laziness, age, or lack of discipline. For now, hold this question. What if the reason a person can pray for clarity, receive an opportunity, and still fail to recognize what is in front of them is not only a problem of faith? What if the receiver itself has become so accustomed to noise, fragmentation, and constant reaction that subtle guidance has to fight for attention? And what would change if that receiver could become more coherent again? Do not answer too quickly. The point is not to reduce a spiritual life to biology. The point is to notice that preparation can happen on more than one level at the same time. Your beliefs can be changing while your habits are changing. Your discernment can be strengthening while your attention is learning not to scatter itself across every demand that reaches for you. That is why the signs around you may feel both spiritual and ordinary. You are praying differently, but you are also choosing differently. You are sensing more, but you are also reacting less. You are becoming more aware of who has access to you, what consumes your attention, and which environments leave you clearer instead of more confused. The sacred and the practical do not need to compete when both are describing the same movement from different angles. Here is the second micro-sign most people ignore. You may find yourself completing small things that have been unfinished for a long time. A drawer gets cleared. A number gets deleted. A conversation finally ends without another round of explanation. These actions can look insignificant, but completion creates a different internal signal than endless postponement. The old season often survives through unfinished business, not because every unfinished task is spiritual, but because open loops consume attention. They keep a piece of you mentally facing backward. When several of those loops begin closing naturally, the change can feel like boredom or emptiness before it feels like freedom. This is why some people panic when their life becomes simpler. They are used to intensity proving that something important is happening. When the arguments stop, the chasing stops, and the constant need to repair everything begins to fade, they wonder whether they have lost their passion. But peace and passivity are not the same thing. Passivity refuses responsibility. Peace allows responsibility without chaos. A watchman at peace can see farther than a warrior who is exhausted from fighting shadows. And the moment that only comes once may require you to see farther than you have ever needed to see before. Notice what just happened in that sentence. The warning is beginning to narrow. we are no longer talking about a vague breakthrough somewhere in the future. We are talking about your ability to recognize a specific kind of opening without depending on the old emotional signals that once told you something mattered. That distinction will become important because the next stage of this message is about reframing delay itself. You have been taught to interpret certain kinds of waiting as evidence that nothing is happening. You have also been taught, sometimes by painful experience, to expect that every delay means rejection is coming. But what if the delay you have been fighting has been changing function? What if one season of waiting was about protection, another about preparation, and this final stretch is about calibration? What if you are not being asked to endure another endless desert? What if you are being brought into a state where the wrong thing can no longer excite you enough to steal the right response from you? That is why the calm can feel unfamiliar. The old version of you recognized movement through adrenaline. The emerging version recognizes movement through clarity. The old version needed the room to change before believing anything had shifted. The emerging version can sense that the center has moved, even while the walls still look the same. There is a final sign I want you to watch before we go deeper. Something that used to feel impossible may now feel strangely simple. Not because the circumstances changed, but because your resistance to it changed. You can imagine saying no without rehearsing the explanation. You can imagine leaving without imagining how everyone will react. You can imagine receiving something good without immediately preparing for the punishment that used to follow good things. That matters more than it appears. A person can ask for a new life while still believing that every new thing comes with a hidden cost. A person can pray for peace while remaining loyal to the patterns that made peace feel unsafe. The moment those assumptions begin weakening, space opens for a different response. Chosen one. This is the threshold beneath the visible threshold. Before the door in front of you changes, your relationship with doors has to change. Before timing can be trusted, urgency has to lose its throne. Before clarity can guide you, noise has to stop feeling like proof that you are alive. And now we are close enough to return to the question I asked earlier. Why are these changes appearing together? Why the altered sleep, the reduced tolerance for false urgency, the strange detachment from old goals, the return of forgotten abilities, and the growing need for clearer internal space? Because they may all be preparing the same receiver, I told you there was a practical discovery we would come back to, and we will, but not yet. Before the science becomes useful, you need to understand the full shape of the problem it is meant to address. Information introduced too early becomes another thing to collect, and this message is not about collecting more ideas. The next movement is where delay gets reframed. We are going to look at why the period that felt like nothing was happening may have been doing something highly specific. We are also going to examine why a counterfeit opening often arrives before the real one, and why the wrong opportunity can feel more emotionally convincing than the right one. Once you see that pattern, the signs you have been noticing will stop looking random. For now, keep one question alive. If your inner world has been changing before your outer world changes, what exactly is being prepared to recognize the moment when it arrives? Do not rush past that question, because the answer connects the silence, the timing, the receiver, and the one distinction that can keep a chosen one from mistaking pressure for permission. Chosen one, the word delay, has carried too much power over the way you interpret your life. You have looked at unanswered questions, unfinished plans, doors that opened halfway and then stopped, and you have called all of it the same thing: delay. But not every period that moves slowly is doing the same work. And if you name every pause as rejection, you can misunderstand the very season that is changing your position. There is a difference between being held back and being moved into the correct place. From the outside, both can look almost identical. Nothing seems to accelerate. Nobody announces that the season has shifted. Yet inwardly, one produces greater confusion, while the other begins producing a strange clarity about what can no longer come with you. Think about where you were several months ago compared with where you are now. The situation may not have changed as dramatically as you expected, but your relationship with it has changed. Things you once begged to control are beginning to feel less important. People whose decisions once determined your emotional weather no longer occupy the same amount of space in your mind. That is not nothing happening. This is the first reframe you need to understand. Sometimes God does not move the object you are staring at because God is moving you into a position from which that object will no longer control the outcome. You keep asking when the door will change, while heaven may be changing the person who will eventually walk through it. And those two movements do not happen at the same speed. A door can open too early for the version of you that still needs approval. An opportunity can arrive too early for the version of you that confuses urgency with obedience. A relationship can return too early for the version of you that still mistakes being chosen by someone else for proof that you are valuable. So, what if the delay was not mainly about making you wait? What if it was about making certain old versions of you unavailable when the moment finally arrives? That question changes everything because it removes the assumption that waiting is empty time. Preparation is not always visible activity. Sometimes preparation looks like losing appetite for what once distracted you. Sometimes it looks like becoming uncomfortable with conversations that used to feel normal. Sometimes it looks like being unable to force yourself back into a role that everybody around you still expects you to play. The spiritual warrior often expects preparation to feel like training, more discipline, more pressure, more tests, more things to overcome. But some of the deepest preparation feels like subtraction. God removes the need to be understood by everyone. God weakens the addiction to immediate answers. God lets certain emotional reflexes become too exhausting to continue carrying. And this is where many chosen ones become frightened, because subtraction does not look like progress when you are measuring your life by accumulation. You thought growth would mean more connections, more opportunities, more recognition, more certainty. Instead, you found yourself needing less noise. You found yourself becoming more selective about what deserves your energy. And, for a while, that can feel like life is shrinking. But what if it is not shrinking? What if it is becoming precise? A watchman cannot watch every direction at the same time. A destiny carrier cannot carry every expectation placed on them. Discernment is not the ability to say yes to more things. Discernment is often the ability to understand what must remain outside the gate, even when it looks familiar, flattering, or useful. This is why the wrong opening can be so dangerous near the end of a long waiting season. After enough delay, almost anything that moves can feel like an answer. The mind becomes tired of uncertainty. The heart becomes tired of waiting. And the first thing that offers relief can begin to look sacred simply because it arrived after a long silence. But movement is not confirmation. Relief is not always alignment. And the fact that something appeared immediately after you prayed does not mean you are forbidden from examining what it requires from you. Here is where the counterfeit becomes subtle. It rarely arrives wearing the face of something you obviously hate. It often resembles what you wanted before the preparation began. It knows the language of the old prayer. It touches the old wound. It offers the old form of validation. The question is not only whether the opportunity looks good, the deeper question is which version of you must become active in order to accept it. If accepting the opportunity requires you to abandon the peace you just learned to protect, pay attention. If it requires you to become desperate for approval again, pay attention. If it makes you feel that you must decide before you can think clearly, pay attention. The warning is not that every fast opportunity is wrong. The warning is that fear should not be the mechanism that makes your decision. This is one of the reasons your reactions have been changing before your circumstances. You are being taught to recognize the difference between excitement and alignment. Excitement can rise instantly because something touches an old desire. Alignment can be quieter because it does not always need to convince you with intensity. You may have noticed this already. Something you once would have pursued immediately appeared again, and instead of feeling thrilled, you felt still. That stillness confused you because you thought you were supposed to celebrate. But what if the stillness was not lack of gratitude? What if it was discernment, refusing to let history make the decision for you? Do you see how the delay may have been changing function? At first, waiting taught endurance. Then, waiting exposed attachment. Then waiting revealed which parts of your identity were built around being seen, needed, chosen, or rescued. And eventually waiting began doing something different. It began calibrating your response. Calibration is not punishment. It is refinement of recognition. A compass that points several degrees in the wrong direction can still look useful at the beginning of a journey. The error only becomes obvious after enough distance. In the same way, a small distortion in what you call peace, love, opportunity, or obedience can send your life toward a place you never intended to reach. So heaven does not only prepare the path, heaven prepares recognition. Because a prepared door is useless to a person who has been trained to walk past anything that does not resemble the old expectation, this is where I want to return to the question I asked you to hold earlier. I told you there was something connected to the condition of the receiver, something that helps explain why a person can believe deeply, pray sincerely, receive real opportunity, and still struggle to recognize what is right in front of them. I said we would come back to it. We are close enough now to begin closing that loop. The reason I waited is simple. A solution means very little before you understand the shape of the problem it is meant to address. If I had given you a practical answer immediately, it could have sounded like another technique to collect, another thing to try, another promise to add to a shelf already crowded with promises. But now the problem has a clearer shape. Your challenge is not simply that you need more information. You already have information. Many of you have spent years reading, praying, listening, studying, reflecting, and trying to understand yourselves. The difficulty is that information still has to pass through attention, interpretation, memory, emotion, and decision before it becomes lived wisdom. That means the receiver matters. Not because the receiver is more important than the message, but because even a clear signal can be difficult to use when the system receiving it is overloaded, fragmented, or constantly reacting to competing demands. Think about your daily life. How often is your attention divided before breakfast? A notification appears, while another thought is still unfinished. One conversation continues in your mind while your eyes are reading something else. You begin a task, remember another task, reach for the phone, return to the first task, and by the end of the hour your body is present, but your attention has been pulled through 6 different rooms. Over time, fragmentation can begin to feel normal. You stop noticing how often you lose a thought halfway through it. You accept brain fog as part of adulthood. You forget how it felt to become completely absorbed in one idea, one creative problem, one prayer, one meaningful conversation. Then, when clarity does arrive quietly, you may distrust it simply because constant mental noise has become more familiar than coherence. This is the bridge between what we have been discussing spiritually and what we will examine practically. It is not an attempt to replace God with biology. It is not an attempt to reduce discernment to a machine. It is an acknowledgement that the mind through which you make decisions is part of the life you have been given to steward. And something very interesting happens when you begin asking a different question. Instead of asking only, "Why has my answer not arrived?" you begin asking, "What condition am I in when the answer arrives?" Am I able to recognize subtle differences? Am I able to remain with one thought long enough to examine it? Am I able to notice peace without immediately covering it with another source of stimulation? That is why the childhood memories we mentioned earlier matter. Many people can remember periods when creativity, imagination, concentration, and curiosity felt far more natural. You could become absorbed in building something, drawing something, solving something, or imagining an entire world without needing constant stimulation. Time disappeared because attention was not being divided every few seconds. Then life became louder. Responsibilities multiplied, screens multiplied, pressure multiplied. You learned to interrupt yourself before anyone else had the chance. You learned to scan for danger, approval, deadlines, messages, reactions, and unfinished obligations at the same time. Chosen one, consider the possibility that some of what you have called loss of intuition is actually loss of access to sustained attention. Consider the possibility that some decisions feel impossible, not because the answer is absent, but because every answer is being heard through a crowded internal room. This is not the complete explanation, it is one layer. And later in this message, I'm going to show you why researchers became interested in a very specific form of coordination inside the human brain, and why that discovery matters to the question of clarity we have been building toward. But before we reach that point, there is one more spiritual pattern you need to see. The counterfeit often benefits from fragmentation. When you are mentally exhausted, you reach for what is obvious. When you are emotionally depleted, you choose what promises immediate relief. When you are scattered, you are more likely to mistake a strong signal for a true signal simply because strong signals are easier to notice. That is why preparation has been slowing some of you down. Not to punish you, to make automatic reactions visible. You needed to see what you choose when you are lonely, what you choose when you feel unseen, what you choose when you are afraid time is running out. Because once those patterns are visible, they stop being invisible rulers. This is the uncomfortable part of reframing delay. Sometimes the waiting did not only protect you from the wrong person or the wrong opportunity. Sometimes it protected the right opportunity from the version of you that would have mishandled it. You may not enjoy hearing that, but there is dignity in it. It means the season was not wasted. It means your story was not frozen while everyone else moved forward. It means something in you was being strengthened so that when responsibility increased, your old wounds would not automatically become the steering wheel. David was anointed before he sat on the throne. The distance between those moments was not proof that the anointing had failed. The distance exposed character, loyalty, restraint, fear, courage, and the temptation to seize through force what had been promised through timing. The throne was not the only thing being prepared. David was being prepared for the throne. Moses carried a calling long before he understood the shape of his assignment. The wilderness did not look like advancement compared with the palace. Yet, the wilderness changed what authority meant to him. It removed one identity before another could be trusted with power. And Elijah knew what it was to experience extraordinary spiritual intensity, followed by exhaustion, so deep that the next instruction was not another public victory. It was rest, food, quiet, and renewed direction. Even in Scripture, preparation does not always look impressive. So stop insulting every quiet season by calling it failure. Some seasons are not designed to impress the people watching you. They are designed to change the person who will eventually be seen. Now let me sharpen the warning again. The closer you get to a real transition, the more tempting it can be to accept a premature substitute simply because you are tired of waiting. That substitute may not look evil. It may look reasonable. It may even look like something you prayed for several years ago. But if the prayer was formed by an older identity, the answer you once imagined may not fit the person who now stands here. This is why you cannot use yesterday's desires as the only measurement for tomorrow's doors. Ask what the door produces in you before asking what it gives to you. Does it produce clarity or compulsion? Does it produce greater integrity or a return to performance? Does it create room for truth or demand that you ignore the discomfort in your spirit because the opportunity looks impressive? Those questions are not fear, they are discernment. And now we arrive at another layer of the mystery. What if the once-in-a-lifetime moment is not difficult because it is hidden from you? What if it is difficult because two doors can appear almost together and the louder one reaches the old version of you first? What if the real test is whether you can remain still long enough for the deeper recognition to catch up with the immediate reaction? That is why the receiver matters so much. The receiver is not just whether you hear a message, it is whether you can distinguish signal from noise after you hear it. It is whether your attention can remain coherent long enough for wisdom to mature into a decision. The research question I mentioned earlier becomes important here. Scientists did not begin with your spiritual language. They approached the problem from another direction. They asked, what happens when different regions and functions of the brain operate with greater coordination? And what changes when that coordination becomes less integrated? The answer opened a path that we will return to after one more piece is in place. I am intentionally not naming the method yet. I am not giving you a product name, a price, or an instruction to act. The point right now is understanding why a practical mechanism could belong in a conversation about spiritual timing without replacing anything sacred. If the mind is part of how you recognize, remember, compare, and choose, then supporting clarity is not the same as manufacturing revelation. You do not need a device to make God speak. You do not need a technique to make your life meaningful. But you do need enough internal space to recognize what you already know when the pressure rises. And that distinction protects the sacred instead of competing with it. Now bring everything together. The delay changed your attachments. The silence exposed your dependence on noise. The loss of urgency revealed which opportunities needed your fear in order to feel important. The strange return of old creative memories reminded you that fragmentation may not be your natural state. Those are not four separate stories. They form one pattern. The pattern says preparation has been happening at the level of identity, attention, discernment, and response. And if preparation has been happening on all four levels, then the moment you are approaching will likely require all four. This is the first part of cognitive closure. Why did the waiting last longer than you expected? Because timing without preparation can become loss. Why did certain relationships, desires, and habits lose their grip before anything obvious replaced them? Because space had to exist before recognition could become clean. And why has the question of attention entered a message about a once-in-a-lifetime spiritual moment? Because your next decision may not depend on hearing something louder. It may depend on recognizing something quieter. The mind that has been trained to chase intensity can miss a truth that arrives without adrenaline. There is still one question unresolved. Who are you becoming when the opportunity finally arrives? Not who were you when you first prayed for it. Not who did other people need you to be. Not who learned to survive the last season. Who are you now after the delay has removed what could not cross with you? That question is the bridge into what comes next, because before we can reveal the moment itself, we need to examine the appointed pattern behind it. We need to look at why Scripture repeatedly places preparation between promise and fulfillment, why a false opening can appear before a true one, and why heaven does not measure readiness by how desperate you are to escape the waiting. Chosen one, your life has not been standing still simply because the evidence has been slow. Something has been changing beneath the visible surface, and the proof may be that the things which once controlled your decisions can no longer command you in the same way. You are not merely waiting for movement. You are being taught how to recognize the movement that deserves your yes. Keep the receiver question open. Keep the two doors in mind. Keep watching the difference between pressure and peace. Because the next layer will show you why an appointed moment often comes after a long season in which almost everything looked delayed, and why the final preparation may be the ability to refuse what arrives first. Chosen one. There is a pattern in Scripture that becomes impossible to ignore once you know what to look for. God often speaks a promise long before the visible conditions are ready to carry it. The promise comes first. Then preparation stretches across a season that can feel completely unrelated to what was spoken. And somewhere between the promise and the fulfillment, there is usually a moment when the person must recognize that waiting has changed into movement. David was anointed while another king still occupied the throne. The oil touched his head, but the palace did not immediately become his home. He returned to ordinary responsibilities, faced conflict, endured misunderstanding, and learned restraint, while the visible evidence seemed to contradict what had been declared over his life. If he had measured the promise only by speed, he could have concluded that nothing happened that day. But something did happen. His identity changed before his environment changed. The throne was future, but the preparation began in the present. And this is the first biblical mirror I want you to hold against your own life. What if the moment that changes everything is not always the moment you receive what was promised, but the moment you become able to recognize what the promise will require from you? David had opportunities to force an outcome. He could have interpreted proximity as permission. He could have said that because Saul was vulnerable, the opening must have been arranged for him to take what had already been promised. Yet he refused to confuse access with authorization. That distinction may be one of the most important things you hear in this entire message. An open door is not automatically your door. A possibility can exist without being an assignment. A person can return without being restored to your future. A position can become available without being connected to your purpose. A shortcut can appear at exactly the moment you are exhausted enough to take it. And sometimes, the counterfeit does not look dark at all. Sometimes it looks like a faster version of what God already promised. That is why discernment becomes more important near a breakthrough, not less important. When nothing is happening, you can afford to examine slowly. But when several things begin moving at once, every unfinished desire inside you suddenly has something to react to. The old hunger wakes up. The fear of missing out wakes up. The part of you that has been tired of waiting whispers that any movement must be better than another season of silence. Chosen one, This is where the false door test begins. Do not ask only what the opportunity offers. Ask what it requires you to abandon in order to receive it. Does it require you to abandon peace? Does it require you to ignore what you already learned? Does it require you to become the version of yourself that God spent the last season teaching you to outgrow? A counterfeit door often speaks directly to the wound that has not fully lost its voice. If rejection was your wound, it may arrive with overwhelming approval. If scarcity was your wound, it may arrive with pressure to seize immediately. If loneliness was your wound, it may arrive through someone who makes you feel intensely seen before they have shown whether they can be trusted with access. The attraction itself does not prove that something is wrong, but attraction is not evidence that something is right either. The deeper test is what happens to your clarity when you stand near it. Does your mind become more settled, or do you become unable to think about anything else? Do you feel free to examine the opportunity, or do you feel afraid that one moment of hesitation will destroy everything? Do you remain connected to your values, or do you immediately begin negotiating with boundaries you once prayed for strength to establish? This is why appointed timing cannot be reduced to urgency. Divine timing may involve quick action, but it does not require panic to create obedience. There is a difference between a clear instruction that requires courage and a pressure response that requires you to stop thinking. One calls you forward, the other chases you from behind. Moses also learned this distinction in a painful way. Long before he returned to Egypt with an assignment, he saw injustice and reacted through his own strength. He understood that something was wrong, but recognition of a problem was not yet the same as readiness for the mission. His concern was real. His timing and method were not yet mature enough to carry what would later be entrusted to him. Then came the wilderness. From the outside, it could look like the story had moved backward. The man connected to a palace became a man tending animals far from the center of power. Years passed without the visible scale of his eventual assignment. Yet the wilderness was not proof that the calling had disappeared. It was changing the vessel that would carry the calling. This is why you cannot judge preparation only by whether it looks impressive. Some of the most important seasons of formation remove status instead of adding it. They make you less interested in being seen. They expose the difference between having influence and needing influence to feel significant. Moses returned differently from the way he left. He still had fears, he still asked questions, but the assignment was no longer a reaction to an emotional wound. It had become something he could carry with a different kind of authority. The outer mission may have looked similar to the concern he felt years earlier, but the man approaching it was not the same man. That is the pattern. Promise, preparation, recognition, movement. The mistake is assuming that recognition will always be obvious. Sometimes, recognition is the shortest part of the entire process. Preparation can take years, while the decision that reveals whether preparation succeeded can arrive in a single conversation. One invitation, one return, one quiet instruction, one choice nobody else understands. That is why the title of this message carries weight. A once-in-a-lifetime moment does not need to last a lifetime. It may be powerful precisely because a long season of preparation narrows into a very small window of recognition. But do not turn that into fear. The purpose is not to make you anxious that every ordinary interaction contains a secret test. Fear destroys the clarity this message is trying to protect. The purpose is to understand that preparation matters because certain decisions cannot be made well by the version of you that existed before the preparation. Esther lived another version of this pattern. She did not begin with the full picture of what her position would require. She entered a place of influence before the reason for that influence became clear. Then a moment came when identity, responsibility, and timing converged. Her position was no longer only about her comfort. Her silence was no longer neutral. The preparation that had placed her near power eventually created a decision that required courage. And notice the structure. Esther did not spend the entire story inside the climactic moment. The moment emerged from everything that came before it. Her history, her position, her relationships, and the danger surrounding her all converged into one decision that suddenly carried more weight than the ordinary appearance of the day could reveal. This is the second thing you need to understand about the moment approaching your own life. The significance may not be visible from the outside. Other people may see a normal conversation. You may feel a shift in what you are willing to tolerate. Other people may see an opportunity. You may recognize that accepting it would reopen a cycle you were called to break. Cycle breaker. Your most important decisions will not always look impressive to the people watching. Sometimes, breaking a cycle means declining what generations before you would have considered success. Sometimes it means refusing a relationship pattern that feels familiar enough to be mistaken for love. Sometimes it means choosing peace when chaos has been normalized for so that peace looks irresponsible. This is where the authority gap becomes important. A person can know scripture, know spiritual language, understand every concept we have discussed, and still make a decision from an unhealed reflex. Knowledge does not automatically become discernment simply because the information is correct. You can quote the right verse and still be responding from fear. You can understand the idea of divine timing and still rush because you are afraid another opportunity will never come. You can speak about boundaries while secretly hoping someone will violate them just enough to prove that they still want you. That is why information alone cannot be the final preparation. The question becomes more intimate now. What happens inside you when the door appears? Not what do you know about doors, not what have you heard about discernment. What actually happens inside your attention, your emotions, your body, and your thinking when something touches the exact desire you have been carrying for years? This is where many powerful people lose themselves. They can remain disciplined when nothing is available, but they become unrecognizable when the thing they wanted finally appears. Scarcity kept them controlled. Opportunity exposes what scarcity was hiding. A watchman must be able to watch the gate even when the person approaching looks familiar. That is harder than watching for an obvious enemy. The obvious threat activates caution immediately. The familiar opportunity lowers the guard. It uses language you recognize. It reflects desires you once confessed in prayer. It may even appear at a time that seems too precise to question. But timing alone is not enough. Familiarity alone is not enough. Intensity alone is not enough. This is why David matters again. The throne was promised, Saul was vulnerable, and an opportunity to remove the obstacle appeared. A person committed only to outcome could have created an entire spiritual explanation for taking the shortcut. He could have called impatience courage. Instead, restraint became evidence that preparation was producing something deeper than ambition. Chosen one, ask yourself a difficult question. If the thing you have prayed for appeared today, would receiving it require you to violate something the waiting season taught you? Would you have to silence the discernment you fought to recover? Would you have to become smaller, more desperate, more performative, or more afraid? If the answer is yes, the appearance of the thing may not mean the season of waiting failed. It may mean the waiting succeeded enough for you to recognize what no longer fits. That is growth many people never celebrate because nothing has been gained visibly. Yet, the ability to refuse the wrong version of a desired outcome is a form of freedom. A person who can only say no to what they never wanted has not yet learned the deepest form of discernment. The deeper test comes when the wrong thing is beautiful, when it speaks your language, when it appears to solve the pain immediately, when people you respect tell you that you would be foolish to let it pass. That is when identity matters more than enthusiasm. You are not merely someone waiting to be rescued from a difficult season. You are a chosen one, being trained to carry responsibility without returning to dependence. You are a watchman, learning to separate movement from meaning. You are a destiny carrier, learning that the weight of what comes next requires a mind and spirit capable of remaining clear while desire is speaking loudly. And here is the identity challenge. Can you remain the person you became in the wilderness when the palace finally calls your name? It is easy to practice boundaries while nobody is testing them. It is easy to say that you value peace when there is no attractive reason to surrender it. It is easy to believe that you have healed from rejection until someone you desperately wanted returns with exactly the words you once begged to hear. The moment of truth does not create your identity from nothing. It reveals which identity has authority when competing desires arrive at the same gate. This is why the last 3 parts of this message have been moving slowly through your internal world. The warning cannot simply tell you that a moment is coming. That would create anticipation without discernment. And anticipation without discernment can make a counterfeit more dangerous, because you begin searching everywhere for proof that the prophecy has arrived. So, I am not asking you to search every message, every stranger, every number, or every coincidence for a hidden instruction. I am asking you to become more precise about the state from which you recognize what matters. There is a profound difference. A person chasing signs becomes easier to manipulate because everything unusual feels meaningful. A watchman does not need everything to be a sign. The watchman notices patterns, tests what enters, remains grounded, and understands that truth does not become stronger because anxiety has made it urgent. Elijah gives us another clue. After intense confrontation and extraordinary events, he entered a state of exhaustion. His next encounter with direction did not depend on another spectacle. The story moves through wind, earthquake, and fire before attention turns toward something quieter. The point is not that God can never speak through something dramatic. The point is that volume is not the same as authority. If you are trained only to recognize God in intensity, you can become vulnerable to anything capable of producing intensity. That includes your own emotions. Anxiety can be intense. Attraction can be intense. Fear can be intense. Relief can be intense. None of those states are automatically wrong, but none of them should be crowned as your only compass. This brings us back to the quiet you have been experiencing. What if the reduction of emotional noise is not absence? What if it is part of the training? What if the season has been teaching you what peace feels like before you need peace to recognize the right door? That would explain why certain old conflicts no longer hold the same fascination. It would explain why you have less appetite for endless explanation. It would explain why some opportunities that once would have overwhelmed you with excitement now create a quieter response. You are not becoming indifferent. You may be becoming calibrated, and calibration changes what counts as evidence. Before, you may have believed that a powerful opportunity should make your heart race. Now you may notice that the deepest yes arrives with a surprising steadiness. Before, you may have believed that being wanted by someone proved connection. Now you may recognize that being respected, understood, and safe matters more than being intensely pursued. Before, you may have believed that a door opening quickly was proof of favor. Now, You may ask whether what is behind the door can coexist with the person God has been forming. This is not hesitation for the sake of hesitation. It is mature recognition. Chosen one, I want to bring the authority gap even closer. Knowing what is true when you are calm is different from recognizing truth when your deepest desire is activated. That gap is where preparation proves itself. A person can spend years saying that they trust divine timing, then abandon every principle when an old dream suddenly becomes available. A person can believe they are free from people-pleasing until a respected person expresses disappointment. A person can believe they have broken a cycle until the cycle returns wearing better clothes. The next level of discernment is not having more spiritual vocabulary. It is becoming harder to pull away from what you already know. That is the watchman identity. The watchman does not panic because something appears at the gate. The watchman does not open because the visitor knows the correct password from an earlier season. The watchman asks whether this belongs to the territory now being protected, and the territory has changed. Your peace is part of the territory. Your attention is part of the territory. Your capacity to think clearly is part of the territory. The future you are preparing to enter cannot be protected if every old pattern still has automatic access to those things. This is why your inner world matters so much before the visible opening appears. The greatest threat near a transition may not be that no opportunity arrives. It may be that the wrong opportunity arrives at the exact moment you are tired enough to stop guarding the gate. And now the warning has reached a deeper level. The question is no longer simply whether a door will open. The question is who will be standing in front of it when it does. Will it be the version of you that believes urgency means importance? Will it be the version that needs outside confirmation before trusting inner clarity? Will it be the version that calls any familiar return a restoration because loneliness has become uncomfortable? Or will it be the person the silence has been forming? The person who can observe without immediately reacting? The person who can receive attention without surrendering discernment? The person who can see movement without inventing meaning before the pattern becomes clear? That person is being prepared for more than an opportunity. That person is being prepared for recognition. And this is the mini-climax I need you to carry forward. The final obstacle may not be the locked door at all. The final obstacle may be whether the person standing before the unlocked door still thinks, feels, and chooses according to the room they were trapped in before. A door can change while your internal map remains old. Freedom can become available while your attention continues scanning for chains. A new territory can appear while your instincts keep looking for the rules of the wilderness. That is why the next movement has to become practical. We have talked about scripture, timing, identity, counterfeit openings, and the training of discernment. Now, we need to look more closely at the receiver itself. Because there is a reason childhood memories of sharpness, creativity, and unusual clarity have started surfacing in this message. There is a reason fragmentation matters. There is a reason the ability to hold attention without constant interruption belongs in a conversation about recognizing a spiritual threshold. The next layer will connect those pieces, not to replace what is sacred, not to tell you that discernment is merely biology, but to show you why the condition of the mind standing at the gate can influence what it notices, what it ignores, and what it mistakes for truth. Chosen one, remember the two doors. Remember David refusing to force the promise. Remember Moses learning that concern is not the same as readiness. Remember Esther discovering that position becomes meaningful when timing and courage meet. Remember Elijah learning that authority is not measured by volume. And above all, remember this. The once-in-a-lifetime moment may not ask whether you can recognize something spectacular. It may ask whether you can remain clear when something deeply desirable appears. Chosen one, before we go any deeper, I want you to remember something about yourself that life may have trained you to forget. There was a time when your mind moved differently. You could become absorbed in an idea without needing permission from anyone, and curiosity could hold your attention longer than fear. You learned quickly because you were not constantly asking whether you were allowed to trust what you noticed. Think back carefully. Maybe you could draw for hours, build things, invent stories, solve problems, memorize details, or notice patterns that adults around you overlook. Maybe people once called you unusually imaginative, unusually sensitive, or simply different. You did not have a sophisticated explanation for it. You simply experienced your mind before years of pressure taught it to divide its attention. Then life became louder. Responsibilities increased. Expectations multiplied. Screens, messages, deadlines, disappointments, comparison, and constant reaction began competing for the same internal space. You learned to think about one thing while worrying about another. You learned to listen while preparing your response, rest while feeling guilty about resting, and pray while part of your attention remained somewhere else. Over time, that divided state can begin to feel normal. And that creates the first mystery of this movement. What if you did not suddenly become less capable? What if the sharper version of you was never destroyed at all? What if access became harder? That is different. If something is destroyed, you have to create it again from nothing. If something is suppressed or disconnected, the question changes. You begin asking what conditions allowed it to operate before, what interrupted those conditions, and whether greater coordination can be restored. This is where the conversation about the receiver becomes practical. Your spiritual life is not being reduced to biology. Your calling is not being reduced to a laboratory measurement. But your attention, memory, decision-making, creativity, and ability to compare subtle signals all move through a living brain. And if the mind is constantly fragmented, even meaningful insight can become difficult to hold long enough to use. You have probably experienced this in ordinary moments. A clear thought arrives in the shower, in prayer, on a walk, or just before sleep. For several seconds, everything seems connected. You know what you need to do. Then another demand enters. The phone lights up, a message arrives, and within minutes, the clarity feels distant again. That does not prove that every clear thought is divine instruction. It proves something simpler. Recognition depends partly on whether you can remain with what you recognize. This is why the memories of childhood sharpness matter. They are not included here merely to make you nostalgic. They point toward a contrast between a mind that once experienced sustained integration more naturally and a mind that has been trained by modern life to switch, scan, react, and divide itself repeatedly. Researchers became interested in that contrast from a completely different direction than spiritual teaching. In 1981, Dr. Roger Sperry received the Nobel Prize for work connected to split brain research. His work helped deepen scientific understanding of how the two hemispheres of the brain can process information differently while functioning as parts of one integrated system. And from that foundation comes a question that matters to everything we have been discussing. What happens when the brain operates with stronger coordination instead of living in a constantly fragmented state? The product research we are about to discuss describes this as whole brain activation, a synchronized condition in which the two hemispheres work together more effectively, rather than behaving like isolated departments competing for the same task. According to the material behind this approach, Children show extraordinary levels of creative potential, while very few adults retain the same level of integrated creative functioning. Whether you first recognize that decline as brain fog, reduced creativity, difficulty holding attention, or the feeling that your sharpest self has become harder to reach, the pattern feels familiar to many people. And here is the micro hook I want you to hold. What if some of what you have interpreted as spiritual distance was intensified by a receiver that had become chronically scattered? That does not mean the signal disappeared. It may mean the room became noisy. A woman from California described living through something close to that. She had already tried prayer, journaling, meditation, and the practices people normally recommend when someone feels disconnected from their own sense of direction. She still believed deeply, but belief and lived clarity no longer felt like the same thing. After using the method I am about to explain, she described a sense that something internally had opened again and that she could feel connected to her own direction with greater ease. A man from Texas described the problem differently. He had spent years carrying responsibilities while the quality of his attention slowly declined. Fog had become so normal that he stopped treating it as fog. After beginning the same approach, he described greater mental clarity and a stronger ability to think through practical decisions instead of feeling as if only part of his mind was available. Two different lives, two different descriptions, but the same underlying question about the condition of the receiver. This is where the answer I asked you to hold finally becomes concrete. A team led by Dr. Daniel Barone, a neurologist in New York City, developed an 8-minute targeted auditory sequence built around what the product describes as neural sync technology. The purpose is whole brain activation, with the goal of encouraging greater synchronization between the left and right hemispheres. The physical protocol is simple. You use headphones, close your eyes, relax, and listen for 8 minutes a day. They call it the genius switch. The distinction matters. This is not positioned as another brainwave track, another binaural beat collection, or a meditation app. Brain waves, gamma states, frequencies, and similar language may be familiar to anyone who has explored this space, but the mechanism described here is different. The genius switch is presented as a neural sync protocol designed around hemisphere coordination and whole brain activation, rather than simply trying to push the brain toward one particular wave state. That is important for anyone who has already tried free brainwave recordings and wondered why nothing seemed to change. Those tools are described in the product material as addressing only part of the picture. The claim here is that synchronization between the hemispheres is the larger target. In other words, the goal is not to make you feel temporarily altered. The goal is to support a more integrated receiver. And notice why this belongs here instead of at the beginning of the message. If I had introduced this before we talked about delay, discernment, false doors, and the condition of your attention, it would have sounded like a disconnected product recommendation. Now you can see the role it is meant to play. It does not choose the door for you. It does not create a calling for you. It does not replace prayer, wisdom, or responsibility. It addresses the receiver. That is why the genius switch is not for everyone. It is for the chosen one who understands that preparation is not only about asking for the promise, it is also about becoming capable of meeting the promise with clarity. It is for the person who knows there is a sharper version of the mind beneath years of fog and constant reaction. It is for the watchman who understands that discernment becomes harder when attention is scattered. It is for the destiny carrier who is no longer willing to treat reduced mental clarity as an unchangeable personality trait. Most people will hear something like this and immediately move on. They have accepted their current level of fog as normal adulthood. They assume that forgetting words, losing focus, struggling to create, and feeling mentally divided are simply the permanent cost of getting older and carrying more responsibility. You are still listening because some part of you remembers another version of your mind. And that memory is exactly why this conversation has weight. There is also a practical reason people pay attention to the offer. Comparable neurofeedback sessions can cost around $300 per hour, while some home systems can cost thousands, with figures around $7,000 cited in the product material. Colleagues around the project suggested that access to this kind of protocol could represent extraordinary value even at $500. The Genius Switch was not released at $500. It was not released at $200. It was not released at $100. The listed price is $49, and on the current page, there is an additional $10 reduction, bringing the price to $39. That gives you lifetime access to the digital audio delivered electronically after purchase, with no shipping involved. The offer also includes 4 bonuses. The first is a guided visualization created by a highly rated creator associated with the Calm app, built around imagining change in money, love, health, and happiness. The second is a smart grocery shopping guide that identifies common foods associated in the material with brain fog and includes shopping shortcuts designed to help reduce monthly spending. The third is a classic manifestation book, more than 100 years old, a text the offer presents as an early foundation for many modern manifestation ideas. The fourth is a printable infographic built around 5 habits, connected to creating an ideal future. And the risk is not placed entirely on you. The offer includes a 100% money-back guarantee. The product material states that you can listen and evaluate the experience, and if you decide it does not deliver what you expected, you can request your money back. The material also cites 18,456 everyday Americans who have used the program, along with stacks of positive reviews. I want to slow the pace here because this is where sales language can easily overpower discernment. Do not buy anything because you feel spiritually threatened. Do not treat a purchase as proof of faith. Do not turn a digital audio into an object of worship. If this resource belongs in your life, it should support the clarity we have been discussing, not replace your responsibility to think clearly. The product is simple in use. Headphones, eyes closed, 8 minutes each day. You do not need to meditate, repeat a mantra, write an affirmation, or force yourself into a special emotional state. If you miss one day, the protocol does not require you to panic or restart your life. You simply return to it. You can also use it alongside yoga or meditation if those are already part of your routine, but the product itself does not require either one. That simplicity is part of the positioning. But simplicity is also where discernment becomes important, because not every easy answer is a true answer, and not every difficult answer is automatically more spiritual. The question is whether the mechanism makes sense to you, whether the guarantee reduces the financial risk enough for your situation, and whether you genuinely want to test the protocol. There is one more element you should know before we move back into the deeper message. The current $39 price is not presented as permanent. The product page warns that pricing can increase, and access to this specific offer may not remain available in the same form indefinitely. I am not giving you a calendar prophecy or telling you that some sacred date disappears tonight. The point is simply that if you decide the resource fits your needs, the current offer is the current offer, not a promise about what the page will show forever. You can find the official access through the link in the description and the pinned comment. But now, I want to separate the resource from the revelation. because confusing those two would weaken everything we have built. The Genius Switch may support clarity. It may help you explore whether greater whole-brain synchronization changes the way you focus, create, and process decisions. But even a clearer mind still has to face the truth. It becomes clear enough to see. And that is the fifth micro-hook of this movement. What if clarity is not the final gift? What if clarity brings you to the point where you can no longer pretend that you do not know what has been keeping you stuck? A clearer receiver may help you recognize the door. It cannot force you to walk through it. A clearer receiver may make an old pattern easier to see. It cannot make you release that pattern if part of your identity is still using it for protection. That is why the next movement becomes more confrontational. We have spent time talking about what happened to your attention. Now we have to talk about what happened to your defenses. Because not every behavior you are being asked to release began as weakness. Some of it began as survival. The habit of overthinking may have once helped you anticipate danger. The habit of pleasing everyone may have once reduced conflict. The instinct to leave before someone could reject you may have once protected you from humiliation. The need to control every detail may have grown during a season when unpredictability genuinely hurt you. Those patterns can begin as protection and later become limitation. And this is where spiritual language can become dangerous if it is used carelessly. You do not need to shame the version of yourself that survived. You need to understand when a survival strategy has remained in command after the environment that created it has changed. The wilderness may have taught you how to ration. The next season may require you to receive. The battlefield may have taught you how to detect threats. The next season may require you to recognize peace without becoming suspicious of it. The season of rejection may have taught you not to depend on applause. The next season may require you to accept healthy recognition without immediately assuming that everyone who sees value in you must have a hidden motive. This is where the real blocker begins to emerge. It is not simply that you need more revelation. It is not simply that you need more information. And it is not simply that the enemy is standing in front of every door trying to keep you out. Sometimes the final resistance is an old internal map that still believes the new territory is dangerous. Chosen one, this is why the childhood memory, the decline mystery, the neuroscience bridge, and the receiver all belonged in the same movement. They brought us to a practical possibility. Greater coherence may help you notice more clearly. But the next question is harder. What will you do when clarity exposes the pattern you have been protecting because it once protected you? That is where we go next. Chosen one. Now, we have reached the place where clarity stops being comfortable. Up to this point, we have talked about timing, discernment, the condition of the receiver, and the possibility of restoring greater coherence to the mind. But even the clearest receiver cannot make a decision for you. Clarity can show you the door, but it can also show you the part of yourself that is still afraid to walk through it. This is where the message becomes personal. The final blocker is not always an enemy standing outside your life. Sometimes it is a strategy that once protected you so well that you never noticed it had become permanent. A response that kept you safe in one season can quietly become a prison in the next. And the hardest patterns to release are often not the ones you hate, they are the ones you still believe you need. That distinction matters. If you learn to overthink because unpredictability once hurt you, overthinking may not feel like fear, it may feel like wisdom. If you learn to please people because conflict once threatened your sense of safety, pleasing may not feel like self-abandonment. It may feel like kindness. If you learn to leave before anyone could reject you, Withdrawal may not feel like avoidance. It may feel like discernment. This is the first micro-hook you need to hold. What if the pattern you have been calling protection is the exact pattern that will try to pull you backward when the right door finally opens? Do not shame that pattern. It began somewhere. Maybe you had to read every expression in a room before speaking, because one wrong sentence could change the atmosphere. Maybe you learned to anticipate disappointment before it arrived, because being surprised by pain felt worse than expecting it. Maybe you became independent, because asking for help once taught you that dependence could be used against you. Those responses were not born from stupidity, they were adaptations. The problem begins when an adaptation survives longer than the environment that required it. A shield is useful in battle, but if you never put it down, eventually you cannot use both hands to receive anything. That is the paradox. What protected you can later restrict you. The ability to detach quickly may have saved you from manipulation, but if it becomes automatic, you may detach from healthy connection before trust has time to grow. The ability to expect disappointment may have softened previous pain, but if it becomes permanent, you may reject good news before it has time to become real. The ability to survive alone may have made you strong, but if strength becomes an identity you are afraid to loosen, receiving support can feel more dangerous than carrying everything yourself. And that is why the next season can feel threatening even when it is better than the last one. You know how to survive what is familiar. You do not yet know what the new territory will ask of you. That uncertainty can make the wilderness feel safer than the promise. Israel knew the hardship of Egypt. They knew what oppression felt like. They knew what it meant to live under rules they did not control. Yet when uncertainty appeared in the wilderness, memory began editing the past. Familiar bondage started sounding safer than unfamiliar freedom. That is what fear can do. It can make a painful past feel predictable enough to prefer over a future that requires trust. Chosen one, be careful here. The old life does not have to become good for you to return to it. It only has to become familiar. The old relationship does not have to become healthy. It only has to call at the moment you feel lonely. The old pattern does not have to make sense. It only has to activate before your new response becomes strong enough to lead. This is why the moment after clarity is often more important than the moment of clarity itself. You can understand a pattern and still obey it. You can recognize manipulation and still respond to it. You can know that a door is wrong and still reach for the handle, because the feeling behind the door is familiar. Recognition is not freedom until recognition changes your response. That is the second micro-hook. The real test is not whether you can identify your old pattern while listening to this message. The real test is what happens when that pattern returns, wearing the exact face that once made you surrender discernment. Will you notice the moment before reaction becomes action? That moment can be very small. A message appears and your body tightens. Before you even read the whole thing, your mind begins building 10 possible outcomes. A person gives you attention and suddenly you feel the old need to prove that you deserve more. An opportunity arrives and your first thought is not whether it aligns with you, but whether someone else will take it if you do not move fast enough. That is the recognition test. Do not judge the first reaction. Observe it. The first reaction may belong to history. The second response can belong to the person you are becoming. This is where your watchman identity becomes practical. The watchman does not destroy every feeling that rises at the gate. The watchman notices what arrived, checks where it came from, and decides whether it receives authority. Anxiety can arrive without becoming instruction. Excitement can arrive without becoming confirmation. Loneliness can arrive without becoming permission. Anger can arrive without becoming strategy. Feelings can enter the room without being handed the keys. That is maturity. And for some of you, this is the hidden blocker you have never named. You do not actually fear failure as much as you fear being unprotected in success. Failure is painful, but familiar. You know how to recover from disappointment. You know how to go quiet, rebuild, disappear, and begin again. You have practiced survival so many times that part of you trusts your ability to survive more than your ability to receive. But what happens when something works? What happens when the relationship is healthy enough that you cannot use chaos as proof of passion? What happens when the opportunity respects your boundaries? What happens when your work begins to be seen and people expect you to stand inside your own value instead of hiding behind preparation? What happens when the prayer is answered in a form that gives you nothing to fight? That is the third microhook. Some chosen ones know how to fight darkness more easily than they know how to live in peace. They know how to pray under pressure. They know how to endure betrayal. They know how to keep moving when nobody understands them. But when the atmosphere becomes safe, the nervous system can keep searching for a threat because vigilance has become part of identity. Then peace feels suspicious. Silence feels like something bad is about to happen. Consistency feels boring. Healthy love can feel less intense than unstable attention. A steady opportunity can feel less exciting than a chaotic one. And without discernment, you can mistake the absence of danger for the absence of destiny. That is why your old internal map matters. Imagine being given a new territory while carrying a map drawn for the wilderness. The roads are different, the landmarks are different, the dangers are different. But if you trust the old map more than the land in front of you, you will keep searching for paths that no longer exist. You may even accuse the new territory of being wrong because it does not match the map. That is what happens when survival wisdom becomes permanent identity. The old map says, if they are quiet, they are leaving. The new territory may say, healthy people do not create drama to prove connection. The old map says, if an opportunity is real, you must grab it immediately. The new territory may say, what belongs to you can withstand examination. The old map says, if you are not exhausted, you are not working hard enough. The new territory may say, stewardship includes preserving the mind and body that must carry the assignment. The old map was not useless. It was simply drawn for somewhere else. This is where I want to separate the practical resource we discussed from the deeper work in front of you. A tool that supports mental clarity can help you notice a pattern earlier. Greater coherence can make it easier to hold a thought, compare options, or become aware of the difference between impulse and intention. That can be valuable, but no tool can decide which identity you will obey when the old map begins speaking. The resource supports the receiver. It does not become your authority. Your responsibility remains yours. That is the trust bridge. You are not being asked to believe that one audio sequence will transform every relationship, heal every wound, or make every spiritual decision obvious. That would place the wrong weight on a practical tool. The deeper work is learning what clarity reveals and having the courage to respond without returning to the patterns that once kept you alive. And this is where compassion matters. You do not heal an old defense by insulting the person who created it. You do not become free by calling your younger self weak. You do not break a cycle by pretending the cycle had no reason to exist. You break it by understanding why it existed, thanking it for what it helped you survive, and refusing to let it govern a life that now requires something different. Maybe your hyper-independence helped you through a season when nobody reliable was available. Honor that strength. Then ask whether the same independence is now blocking trustworthy people from standing beside you. Maybe your suspicion protected you from someone who repeatedly lied. Honor the discernment that developed. Then ask whether suspicion now activates before evidence appears. Maybe your perfectionism helped you create order when everything around you felt unstable. Honor the discipline. Then ask whether the demand to get everything right is preventing you from moving at all. This is not self-accusation. It is inventory. A cycle breaker has to know what is being carried before deciding what stops here. And sometimes what stops here is not an obvious curse. Sometimes it is a coping strategy that became so respected within the family that nobody realized it was costing everyone peace. Maybe your family called emotional silence strength. Maybe they called overwork responsibility. Maybe they called constant worry love. Maybe they called controlling every outcome wisdom. Maybe they called never needing anyone maturity. You can honor the people who taught you survival without repeating every survival strategy they handed you. That is what breaking a cycle can look like. Not rebellion for the sake of rebellion. Discernment. Chosen one, now ask yourself another uncomfortable question. When something good begins, what is your automatic exit strategy? That is the fourth micro hook. Do you become suspicious? Do you start looking for flaws? Do you create distance? Do you test the person until they become exhausted? Do you procrastinate until the opportunity expires? Do you tell yourself that you need one more sign, one more week, one more piece of proof, even after the evidence has become clear? Sometimes delay is divine. Sometimes delay is fear wearing spiritual language. That is why the next stage requires precision. A person can misuse discernment to avoid vulnerability. They can say they are waiting on God when they are actually waiting for certainty that life cannot provide. They can say they are protecting peace while refusing every situation that asks them to grow. They can say the timing feels wrong when the real issue is that the timing feels unfamiliar. Not every discomfort is a warning. Growth can be uncomfortable. Healthy boundaries can be uncomfortable. Receiving love after betrayal can be uncomfortable. Being seen after years of hiding can be uncomfortable. Taking responsibility for a larger assignment can be uncomfortable. The question is not whether discomfort exists. The question is what kind of discomfort it is producing. Fear-based discomfort usually narrows you into panic, compulsion, or old behavior. Growth-based discomfort can be intense, but somewhere beneath it there is often a steady clarity that says, this is new, not wrong. That difference can be subtle, and that is why your attention matters. If you react immediately, you may never stay present long enough to feel the difference. The old map depends on speed. It wants an instant decision. Run, reply, hide, prove, control, reject, return. The new response often begins with a pause, not a passive pause, a conscious pause. One breath long enough to notice what is happening inside you before history speaks through your mouth. That pause can change a life. Because a pattern is most powerful when it is mistaken for identity, the moment you can say, this reaction is happening inside me, but it is not the whole of me, distance appears between trigger and choice. That distance is where authority returns. You do not need to eliminate every old feeling before entering a new season. You need to stop treating every old feeling as prophecy. That is freedom with maturity. David still knew danger while moving toward the throne. Moses still had questions while carrying the assignment. Esther still faced fear when responsibility became unavoidable. Preparation did not remove every human response. It changed which response had final authority. Chosen one, the same is true for you. You may still feel fear when the right door opens. You may still feel the urge to withdraw. You may still hear the old voice saying that something this peaceful cannot be real. The presence of the old voice does not mean you have failed. The question is whether the old voice still gets to choose. That is the recognition test in its simplest form. Can you hear the old pattern without becoming the old pattern? Can you notice the shield without lifting it automatically? Can you feel the impulse to run without deciding that running is wisdom? Can you receive attention without performing? Can you be offered opportunity without becoming desperate? Can you experience peace without creating a problem simply because your system is more familiar with chaos? This is the kind of preparation that cannot be seen from the outside. Nobody applauds the message you chose not to send. Nobody sees the moment you felt panic and waited until clarity returned. Nobody knows when you almost reopened a dead cycle and then remembered what it cost you to close it. But those invisible decisions are often where a new identity becomes real. That is why your season has felt private. Some of the greatest changes were never designed to be publicly impressive. They were designed to make certain old reactions unavailable. And once those reactions lose automatic authority, the same external situation produces a completely different outcome. The person who once manipulated you may try the same tactic and receive silence instead of explanation. The opportunity that once would have made you abandon every boundary may arrive and meet a calm question. The old relationship may return and discover that familiarity no longer grants access. The fear of missing out may rise and find that your identity no longer moves on command. That is how you know the map is changing, not because temptation disappears, because obedience to the old pattern disappears. And this brings us to the mini-climax of this movement. The enemy you have been watching may not be able to stop the door from opening. The greater danger is that an old map could persuade you to misread the territory after it opens. You could call peace boredom. You could call consistency lack of chemistry. You could call healthy distance rejection. You could call thoughtful timing delay. You could call growth danger simply because growth asks you to live without armor you have worn for years. The final battle may not be about getting out of the wilderness. It may be about refusing to rebuild the wilderness inside the promised territory. Read that carefully in your spirit. You can leave an environment physically and carry its rules internally. You can leave scarcity and still make every decision from fear of loss. You can leave rejection and still expect abandonment from everyone who comes close. You can leave chaos and still create urgency because peace feels unfamiliar. That is why God can change your surroundings and still continue working on your interpretation. The external door and the internal map have to meet. Chosen one. This is why the once-in-a-lifetime moment cannot be revealed too early in the message. If I told you only what the moment looks like, you might search for the external sign and ignore the internal response that determines whether you can recognize it. Now you know better. The moment will involve a door, but the deeper revelation will involve the person standing before it. And we are finally ready to name what that means. In the next movement, the open loop from the beginning will begin to close. We will identify what the once-in-a-lifetime moment actually is, why it often arrives without the spectacle people expect, and the final sign that separates an appointed opening from a repetition of the old pattern. But carry one truth with you before we go there. Your survival strategies are not proof that you are broken. They are evidence that you learned. Now the learning has to evolve. The shield that protected you does not have to become the identity that defines you. The map that guided you through one territory does not have to govern the next. The version of you that survived deserves gratitude. The version of you that receives will require permission, and that permission is not coming from the people who misunderstood you. It is not coming from the person who left. It is not coming from the opportunity that rejected you before. It is not coming from the crowd. It is coming from the moment you recognize that you are no longer required to live according to conditions that no longer exist. Chosen one, that recognition is closer than you think. The door is not the only thing changing. The person at the door is changing too. Chosen one, we have finally reached the place where the question from the beginning can no longer remain open. But before I name the moment itself, there is one detail you need to see clearly, because without it, you could hear the answer and still misunderstand what it means. The most important moment of your life may not arrive looking like destiny. It may arrive looking almost too calm to deserve your attention. That is why the preparation had to come first. You needed to understand the difference between delay and repositioning. You needed to see why a counterfeit door can activate old hunger more quickly than a true door activates peace. You needed to understand the receiver, the old map, and the survival patterns that can continue speaking even after the danger that created them is gone. Now, the pieces can come together. The once-in-a-lifetime moment is not simply the day something extraordinary happens to you. It is the point where preparation, recognition, and choice meet at the same time. It is the moment when something that could have reached the old version of you finally reaches the person you have become, and you recognize that responding the old way would cost you the future the waiting season prepared you to carry. That is why this moment can be quiet. There may be no thunder. There may be no dramatic announcement. There may be no person standing in front of you saying that your entire life depends on the next decision. Instead, there may be a conversation that feels unusually clear. An opportunity may appear without forcing you to chase it. A relationship may reveal its true nature without another argument. A decision you once believed would be impossible may suddenly become simple because something inside you is no longer divided. This is the first layer of the reveal. The moment is not only the external opening, the moment is the internal recognition that you no longer need the old pattern to tell you what the opening means. That is what makes it once in a lifetime. Not because God is incapable of giving you another opportunity, not because one human mistake destroys your entire destiny, but because there are thresholds that can only be crossed by a particular version of you after a particular season has completed its work. Once you cross them, you cannot become innocent of what you now know. You may ignore the knowledge. You may resist it. You may delay acting on it. But you cannot honestly return to the belief that you never saw the pattern. That is why this moment carries weight. Chosen one, think about how different you are from the person who first began praying for change. That person may have wanted rescue. You now understand responsibility. That person may have wanted the door to open. You now understand that the person walking through the door matters as much as the door itself. The old version wanted proof. The emerging version wants alignment. The old version wanted relief from uncertainty. The emerging version is learning how to remain clear even when not every detail has been explained. That difference is the evidence that the season did something. And here is what many people miss entirely. The final sign is not always excitement. Sometimes the final sign is the absence of compulsion. You can look at the opportunity without feeling that you must possess it immediately. You can consider the relationship without abandoning yourself inside the possibility. You can receive good news without instantly imagining how you will lose it. There is room inside you. There is space between the event and the response. There is enough quiet to hear what you actually think. That space is not emptiness. It may be one of the clearest signs that the old pattern is losing authority. This is why the right door can feel almost strangely calm. The counterfeit often has to activate something: fear, scarcity, ego, loneliness, the need to be selected. The need to prove that the years of waiting were worth something. The appointed opening does not always need those emotions to persuade you. It can simply stand there. And because it does not chase you, the part of you trained by chaos may initially wonder whether it matters. That is the test. Can you recognize importance without panic? Can you recognize love without instability? Can you recognize opportunity without desperation? Can you recognize direction without needing 100 external voices to approve it first? This is where the watchman becomes more than an identity label. The watchman notices what changes when the gate opens. The watchman notices whether peace remains. The watchman notices whether the old self begins bargaining for control. The watchman does not confuse the first emotional wave with the final truth. And the watchman is willing to wait long enough for the deeper recognition to speak. This is also why a simple resource that supports clearer attention may have value for some people at this stage. If you are still thinking about the neurological support mentioned earlier, the official resource is available below for you to examine in your own time. It is there as a practical support for the receiver, not as a substitute for prayer, discernment, wisdom, or responsibility. Use clarity to strengthen your ability to choose, never to surrender your authority to a tool. Now return immediately to the deeper question. How do you know when preparation and recognition have actually met? You know because the decision in front of you begins exposing the old map without requiring you to obey it. The old map may say, rush. You notice the voice, but you do not rush. The old map may say, they will leave if you set the boundary. You feel the fear, but you do not abandon the boundary. The old map may say, this is your only chance. You hear the scarcity, but you still examine the door. That is not weakness. That is authority becoming visible in behavior. This is the second layer of the reveal. The moment God is warning you about is the moment when the old pattern and the new identity are both present, but only one can lead the next decision. That is the convergence. The external situation gives you something real to respond to. The internal history gives you an old response to repeat. The preparation gives you another way to choose. And, for a brief moment, all three stand in the same room. That is why the moment can feel strangely familiar and completely new at the same time. The situation may resemble something from your past. The person may remind you of someone you once knew. The opportunity may resemble something you once lost. The fear may sound exactly like fear you have felt before, but you are different. And because you are different, the same kind of event no longer has to produce the same outcome. That is how cycles break, not because history disappears. Because history stops receiving automatic authority over the present, the cycle breaker does not need a completely different world. The cycle breaker learns how to make a different decision inside a familiar pattern. For some of you, this moment may involve saying yes. You have spent so long protecting yourself from disappointment that receiving something good now feels more dangerous than refusing it. The old pattern tells you to wait until certainty becomes absolute. But the deeper clarity says you have enough evidence to move with wisdom. For others, the moment will involve saying no. Something you wanted for years may finally arrive, but it arrives asking for access to a version of you that no longer exists. The invitation is real, but the alignment is not. That no can be painful. You may grieve the fact that the thing appeared after you had already outgrown it. You may wonder why it did not arrive earlier. You may feel tempted to accept it simply because the old version of you waited so long. But a late answer to an old prayer does not automatically become the assignment of your current season. That is discernment. For someone else, the moment may involve remaining still. Not every threshold requires immediate movement. Sometimes the once-in-a-lifetime decision is refusing to interrupt a process that is already working simply because silence makes you uncomfortable. You have spent years trying to fix every pause. This time, the instruction may be to stop interfering. Do you see how different these possibilities are? That is why nobody can reduce this message to one external sign. The moment is not defined by whether a specific person calls you. It is not defined by whether money arrives on one particular day. It is not defined by a number on a clock. The moment is defined by convergence, preparation, recognition, choice. The circumstances create the threshold, but the identity you bring to the threshold determines whether the old cycle continues. This is where the open loop from the beginning begins to close. At the start, I warned you that the moment could arrive so quietly that you might overlook it. Now you know why. You were expecting the evidence to be external, but the final evidence may be internal. You may notice that the very situation that once would have destabilized you now produces clarity. You may notice that you can hear a familiar voice without surrendering your judgment. You may notice that what once felt irresistible now feels optional. Or you may notice that something healthy no longer feels boring simply because there is no chaos attached to it. That is a profound shift. It means your internal definition of normal is changing, and when normal changes, destiny can stop looking foreign. A person trained by chaos may pray for peace and then reject peace because it does not feel intense enough. A person trained by scarcity may pray for abundance and then sabotage stability because they trust struggle more than consistency. This is why the final sign is so important. The sign is not that fear disappears completely. The sign is that fear is no longer the loudest authority in the room. You may still feel nervous. You may still need time. You may still ask wise questions. You may still seek counsel. But beneath those human responses, there is a steadiness you did not have before. There is an inner refusal to betray what the last season taught you. That steadiness deserves your attention. Do not romanticize it. Do not turn every calm feeling into divine instruction. Test the facts. Look at character. Look at consequences. Look at whether the decision requires honesty or performance. Look at whether it deepens integrity or asks you to violate it. Discernment is not abandoning reality. Discernment becomes stronger when reality and inner clarity can be examined together. This is where mature faith differs from fantasy. Mature faith does not require you to ignore evidence. Mature faith does not demand that you call every desire a promise. Mature faith allows you to believe deeply while still examining what is actually in front of you. The watchman does not become careless because the gate feels sacred. The watchman looks closer. Chosen one. Remember how David refused to use a premature opportunity as permission. Remember how Esther reached a moment when position and responsibility became inseparable. Remember how Moses had to become different before the assignment he sensed earlier could be carried differently. These stories do not teach that every delay guarantees a spectacular reward. They teach something more useful. Preparation changes the meaning of opportunity. The same door means something different to an unprepared person than it means to a prepared one. The same influence means something different to someone hungry for validation than to someone who has learned identity without applause. The same relationship means something different to someone terrified of loneliness than to someone capable of choosing connection without abandoning self-respect. That is why God may allow the formation season to feel longer than the visible moment itself. The moment may last minutes. The preparation may take years. But when the moment comes, the years become visible inside the response. Nobody else may understand why you say no. Nobody else may understand why you finally say yes. Nobody else may understand why you remain still instead of chasing. They did not live through the formation that taught you the difference, and you do not need to turn every decision into a public defense. The person who has grown in discernment becomes less dependent on making everyone agree with the choice. That alone may be part of the evidence. The old version of you needed consensus. The emerging version can listen to wise counsel without outsourcing identity. You can remain humble without becoming directionless. Now, I want to address one danger before the loop closes completely. Once you recognize this pattern, do not begin searching desperately for the moment. Desperation recreates the very noise that preparation has been reducing. You do not need to stare at every interaction wondering whether this is it. You do not need to interpret every delay, every dream, every coincidence, or every change in mood as a coded instruction. The point of discernment is greater clarity, not greater obsession. Live, observe, stay honest. Protect your attention. Let people reveal character over time. Let opportunities survive reasonable questions. Let peace exist without immediately demanding that it predict the future. The moment does not need your panic in order to become important. And if an opportunity is so fragile that one thoughtful pause destroys it, that fact itself may tell you something worth knowing. What belongs to a mature decision can survive examination. This brings us to the exact warning. The moment only comes once in the sense that this particular convergence of preparation, identity, and choice will never exist in exactly the same form again. Tomorrow, you will know what you chose today. Next season, you will carry the consequence of this response. The person you are becoming will continue changing. That is why the moment matters. Not because heaven is waiting to punish one imperfect move, because life keeps moving. A threshold is a threshold, because once you cross it, the territory changes. You cannot remain forever with one foot in every season. Eventually, identity becomes decision. This is where the title stops being a mystery. God warns because the moment may be mistaken for something ordinary. It may look like one honest conversation, one boundary held, one opportunity examined without desperation, one old pattern refused, one healthy connection allowed to remain healthy without testing it into chaos, one decision to stop reopening what has already shown you what it is. The magnitude may become clear only later. In the moment itself, you may simply feel unusually clear. That is why the peace matters, not as magical proof, as contrast. You know what compulsion feels like. You know what obsession feels like. You know what panic feels like. You know what it feels like to make a decision mainly because you cannot tolerate uncertainty. When those forces are present but no longer controlling you, something significant has changed. The watchman is awake without being frantic. The spiritual warrior is strong without needing a battle. The cycle breaker can recognize the old door without needing to walk through it again. The destiny carrier can accept responsibility without turning it into performance. That is the identity convergence this message has been building toward. And now the primary loop can close. The once-in-a-lifetime moment is the threshold where the person God has been forming finally meets an opening that requires that new identity to lead. The hidden danger is that the opening may resemble an old pattern closely enough to activate an old response. The final sign is that beneath fear, excitement, uncertainty, or desire, there is a new steadiness that allows you to observe before reacting and choose without betraying what the formation season taught you. That is the warning. Do not worship the door. Do not fear the door. Recognize who is standing before it. You, not the person who first entered the wilderness, not the person who begged for approval, not the person who believed struggle was the only proof of purpose. You are standing there with everything the season taught you. And the next decision is where that teaching becomes visible. The revelation is now complete, but the message is not over. Because recognizing the moment is only the first responsibility. The next responsibility is remaining aligned after recognition. Many people see clearly for 1 hour and then spend the next week negotiating themselves back into the old pattern. That is what we address next. How do you remain in the new response after the emotional intensity fades? How do you protect clarity without turning it into rigidity? How do you move through the threshold without rebuilding the old room on the other side? Chosen one, the door was never the entire story. The person walking through it was the story too. And now you know why the silence came first. Chosen one, now that the moment has been named, a different question becomes more important than the one that brought you here. What happens after you recognize it? What happens after clarity arrives? After the old pattern becomes visible? After you finally understand why the door in front of you feels different from the doors behind you? Recognition can change a moment, but what you do after recognition determines whether that moment becomes a new direction or only another insight you remember later. This is where many people underestimate the real work. They think revelation is the finish line. They believe that once something becomes clear, the struggle is over. But clarity often creates a new responsibility because you can no longer hide behind confusion in the same way. You know more now than you knew at the beginning of this message. You know why the silence mattered. You know why the counterfeit often speaks to the old wound. You know why the receiver matters, why the old map can survive after the territory changes, and why peace can feel unfamiliar after years of living through intensity. So the question is no longer whether you can see the pattern. The question is whether you can remain aligned when the pattern tries to call you back. That is the first micro hook of this movement. What happens tomorrow morning when this message is no longer playing? What happens when the emotion settles? What happens when the person you already decided to release sends one perfectly timed message? What happens when the opportunity you questioned suddenly offers you more? What happens when the boundary you felt strong enough to hold tonight becomes uncomfortable in the presence of someone you still care about? That is where recognition becomes real. The first stage is recognize. You see what is happening. You notice the old reaction. You understand the pattern before it fully takes over. That matters because what remains unconscious feels inevitable. The moment you recognize it, inevitability begins to weaken. You can finally observe the mechanism instead of becoming the mechanism. But recognition alone is not enough. The second stage is remain. Remain in the new understanding long enough for the old pressure to pass without making the decision for you. Remain with the discomfort of not fixing everything immediately. Remain with the silence after setting a boundary. Remain with peace even when part of you starts looking for evidence that peace is about to disappear. Then comes the third stage. Receive. Not grab. Not chase. Not force. Receive. That difference is larger than it sounds. A person who grabs is often responding to scarcity. A person who chases is often responding to fear. A person who forces is often trying to control uncertainty before uncertainty has time to reveal its meaning. Receiving requires enough strength to let what is real remain real without exhausting yourself trying to make it prove itself every hour. Recognize, remain, receive. Those three movements are the bridge between revelation and transformation. Most people become fascinated with the first one because recognition feels powerful. You finally understand why the relationship repeated itself. You finally see why the same type of opportunity keeps attracting you. You finally realize why your mind becomes noisy at exactly the moment you need clarity. But remaining is quieter. Nobody applauds remaining. Nobody sees you choosing not to reopen the conversation. Nobody sees you waiting before responding to a message designed to provoke the old version of you. Nobody sees you resisting the urge to explain your boundary for the 10th time. Yet that quiet middle stage may be where the entire future changes. Chosen one, give yourself credit for how far you have stayed with this message, but do not turn that into pride. You stayed long enough to move past the surface promise and into the uncomfortable part where identity has to become behavior. Many people want a revelation that makes them feel powerful. Far fewer are willing to examine the response that keeps giving their power away. You have already walked through the diagnosis. You stayed through the reframe. You stayed when the message stopped blaming everything outside you and began examining the internal map. That willingness matters because a destiny carrier cannot be governed only by information that feels flattering. Sometimes truth restores dignity. Sometimes truth asks for responsibility. The two belong together. You were never being prepared merely to feel special. You were being prepared to become trustworthy with what you recognize. A watchman who sees a pattern but refuses to respond differently is only a witness to repetition. A cycle breaker has to interrupt something. Not every cycle is interrupted through confrontation. Some cycles end because you stop feeding them attention. Some end because you stop calling confusion chemistry. Some end because you stop returning every time loneliness becomes louder than memory. Some end because you finally allow consistency to remain boring long enough to become safe. This is why staying can feel harder than leaving. Leaving often produces a dramatic moment. Staying aligned requires dozens of smaller decisions after the dramatic moment is over. You can close a door once and still spend weeks deciding not to reopen it in your mind. That is not failure. That is integration. The new identity is learning how to live in ordinary time. And ordinary time is where the old pattern will test whether the revelation was temporary. You may feel tempted to check whether they noticed your absence. You may wonder whether the opportunity is still available. You may begin replaying every detail until the clarity you had becomes surrounded by hypothetical questions. What if I misunderstood? What if I was too cautious? What if this was my only chance? What if I should explain one more time? Those questions can sound intelligent while still being driven by the same fear. This is why you need a simple test. Does the new question bring more clarity, or does it pull you back into compulsion? Does it help you examine reality, or does it make you abandon everything you already learned because uncertainty has become uncomfortable? Discernment allows new evidence. Fear demands endless reassurance. Those are not the same thing. You are allowed to reconsider when facts change. You are allowed to ask questions. You are allowed to seek wise counsel. But reconsideration should be responding to new information, not merely to the discomfort of holding a new boundary. The old map will often try to make discomfort look like evidence that you chose incorrectly. Remember that. Discomfort can simply mean that the pattern did not receive its usual reward. If you always responded immediately, waiting will feel wrong. If you always apologized first, allowing another person to take responsibility will feel wrong. If you always chased the opportunity, observing it will feel passive. If you always rescued everyone, letting someone experience the consequences of their own choices can feel cruel. New behavior often feels unnatural before it feels normal. That does not automatically make it right, but it does mean unfamiliarity cannot be your only reason for turning back. This is where the three-stage pattern becomes important again. Recognize the reaction. Remain long enough to understand it. Receive only what survives clarity. Do not reverse the order. Do not receive first and ask questions afterward. Do not chase first and call it discernment later. Do not surrender your peace simply because something has finally arrived. The right opportunity does not need you to become less truthful in order to keep it. Chosen one, imagine a person standing at the edge of a river after years in dry land. The first instinct may be to drink as quickly as possible because scarcity trained the body to believe the water could disappear. But abundance requires a different relationship with provision. You do not have to consume everything immediately. You do not have to possess every possibility. You do not have to say yes simply because you finally can. Some forms of abundance are revealed by the freedom to choose. That freedom is one of the clearest differences between the old season and the next one. Scarcity says this is the only person who will understand you. Clarity says connection that requires self-abandonment is not the only connection available. Scarcity says this is the only opportunity you will ever receive. Clarity says urgency alone cannot define value. Scarcity says if you do not prove yourself now, you will disappear. Clarity says what has been built deeply does not require constant performance to exist. That is how the internal economy changes. And when the internal economy changes, the same external offer no longer controls you. This is the point where some people confuse detachment with indifference. They are not the same. Indifference says nothing matters. Detachment says this matters, but it does not own me. Indifference refuses to care. Detachment allows care without surrendering identity. You can love something without being controlled by whether it stays. You can want something without making desperation your method. You can hope without forcing certainty. That is a mature relationship with desire. The old version of you may have believed that wanting something strongly meant holding it tightly. The emerging version learns that sometimes the strongest position is an open hand. If it belongs, you can receive it. If it reveals that it does not belong, you can release it without turning the release into proof that you were forgotten. That is freedom from the old interpretation. Chosen one, here is the second micro hook you need to hold. The most dangerous moment after revelation may not be the return of an obvious enemy. It may be the return of an old feeling, a familiar loneliness, a familiar urgency, a familiar doubt, a familiar need to know right now. The feeling can return even after the identity has changed. Do not confuse the return of the feeling with the return of the old season. An echo is not the same as a command. You can hear an old fear without entering the old room. You can feel the old impulse without reopening the old door. You can remember the old relationship without returning to the old agreement. That distinction will protect your peace. The spiritual warrior in you does not need to fight every echo. Some echoes disappear because you stop answering them. Not every internal voice deserves a debate. Sometimes silence is the final boundary. This is where staying aligned becomes less dramatic and more disciplined. You choose what you repeatedly expose your attention to. You choose whether you keep revisiting the same evidence after the conclusion is already clear. You choose whether you create more confusion by asking 10 people to interpret something your own experience has already made obvious. Counsel can sharpen discernment. Crowds can also dilute it. Wisdom is not measured by the number of opinions you collect. The watchman listens carefully, then watches what the facts do over time. Character repeats. Patterns reveal themselves. Truth becomes more stable under examination. That is why you do not need to force closure before closure is ready. Some answers become clear because you stop touching them. Some situations reveal themselves because you stop managing how they appear. Some people show their intentions when you stop doing the emotional labor required to keep the connection alive. This is the third micro hook. Recognition tells you what you saw. Remaining tells you whether you trust what you saw. Receiving reveals whether the thing itself can stand without your old pattern holding it together. That is why the order matters so much. If a relationship survives only while you overfunction, then your overfunctioning was part of the structure. If an opportunity remains attractive only while you imagine what it could become, then imagination may have been supplying what reality did not. If a promise of change requires you to ignore repeated evidence, then hope may have crossed into self-betrayal. Let reality participate in discernment. You do not have to make truth prove itself through drama. You can watch, you can listen, you can allow time to reveal what urgency tries to hide. And yes, this can be uncomfortable because you are no longer controlling the outcome through constant effort. That loss of control may feel like vulnerability. It is vulnerability, but healthy receiving requires some vulnerability. You cannot receive with both hands while one hand is still gripping the old map and the other is reaching for the new territory. Something has to loosen. That does not mean becoming careless. It means becoming available. Available to good evidence. Available to consistency. Available to relationships that do not need chaos to feel alive. Available to opportunities that grow through integrity rather than pressure. Available to rest without interpreting rest as laziness. Available to a life that does not require you to prove every day that you deserve to be in it. For some of you, that may be the hardest transformation of all. You know how to earn. You know how to struggle. You know how to make yourself useful enough to be needed. But receiving asks a different question. Can you accept something good without immediately creating a debt inside yourself? Can someone help you without you rushing to repay them before the kindness has even landed? Can someone love you without you performing usefulness every hour? Can an opportunity recognize your value without you explaining your entire history? Receiving can expose worthiness wounds that struggle kept hidden. That is why the next season may feel more emotionally revealing than the last one. The last season showed you how strong you could be under pressure. The next one may show you whether you can remain whole when pressure is no longer required. And do not underestimate that transition. A person accustomed to proving strength can accidentally recreate adversity because adversity gives them a familiar identity. A spiritual warrior may secretly feel lost when there is no battle. But a warrior who can only exist in war has not yet learned stewardship. Peace needs stewardship too. Provision needs stewardship. Healthy connection needs stewardship. Influence needs stewardship. Clarity needs stewardship. And stewardship is quieter than survival. This is why the breakthrough after the breakthrough matters. The first breakthrough is external or cognitive. You see the truth. You make the choice. You recognize the door. The deeper breakthrough is behavioral. You stop reacting as though the old territory still has jurisdiction. That is the mini-climax toward which this entire movement has been building. Breakthrough does not truly begin when everything outside you changes. It begins when the old pattern loses the ability to make the same decision through you. Read that again inside yourself. A new job is not automatically a new season if you carry the same fear of authority into every room. A new relationship is not automatically a new pattern if you bring the same abandonment test into every moment of closeness. More money is not automatically abundance if every dollar still activates terror about losing everything. A new opportunity is not automatically freedom if you still believe saying no would make you worthless. The geography can change while the internal government remains the same. The deeper breakthrough is a change of government. Fear can speak without ruling. Scarcity can appear without ruling. Old memories can surface without ruling. The need for approval can ache without ruling. The old map can be remembered without ruling. That is authority. That is what the long preparation was trying to build. And if you choose to support your clarity with the practical resource mentioned earlier, the access point remains where it was placed for you. You can examine it privately if it fits what you need, and you can leave it alone if it does not. The resource is only a support for the receiver. The decision about how you live after recognition remains yours. Now, return to the deeper work. The next question is how to protect this new internal government without becoming rigid, because there is another danger. After breaking one pattern, people sometimes become so afraid of repeating it that they build a new prison around avoidance. They stop trusting anyone. They stop taking risks. They call isolation peace. They call emotional shutdown boundaries. That is not the freedom this message is pointing toward. A boundary is meant to protect healthy participation in life. A wall is meant to prevent participation. Discernment asks which one you are building. If nobody can reach you, nobody can manipulate you. But nobody can love you deeply either. If you never take another opportunity, you will never choose the wrong one. But you will also never practice wise courage. If you never trust again, you reduce betrayal. You also reduce connection. Healing is not the elimination of all risk. It is the ability to engage reality without abandoning yourself. That is a much stronger position. You can enter a relationship with eyes open. You can accept an opportunity with questions intact. You can receive recognition without making recognition your identity. You can forgive without restoring access automatically. You can care without rescuing. You can hope without pretending you know every outcome. That is what the new territory requires. Chosen one, the old pattern was often extreme because survival is extreme. All in, all out. Trust completely. Trust nobody. Fight everything. Avoid everything. Explain everything. Disappear completely. The emerging identity can hold more complexity. You can be cautious without being closed. You can be hopeful without being naive. You can be powerful without being hard. You can be sensitive without surrendering discernment. You can be a watchman without turning every shadow into an enemy. This balance is the proof that the internal map is being redrawn. It is also why the old season cannot be your permanent reference point. You learned important things there. Keep the wisdom. Release the reflex. Keep the discernment. Release the hypervigilance. Keep the boundaries. Release the bitterness. Keep the independence that taught you capability. Release the belief that needing anyone makes you unsafe. Keep the lesson without rebuilding the classroom. That is how a cycle breaker honors the past without repeating it. And this does not happen in one dramatic act. It happens through repetition. A new response repeated until it becomes familiar. A healthy boundary repeated until guilt no longer controls it. A pause repeated until urgency loses its throne. Receiving repeated until provision stops feeling suspicious. Honest communication repeated until confusion is no longer mistaken for intimacy. The new territory becomes home through practice. That is why you should not be discouraged if the new response still requires effort. Effort does not mean it is false. At first, the old pattern may feel natural because you practiced it for years. The new response may feel deliberate because you have practiced it for weeks. Give the new identity time to become embodied. Do not abandon a healthier pattern simply because the unhealthy one is more familiar. Familiarity is not authority. Repetition created familiarity once. Repetition can create a new familiarity. This is where patience returns, but it is a different kind of patience than the waiting season. Before, patience meant enduring what had not arrived. Now, patience means becoming stable inside what you have recognized. Before, you were waiting for clarity. Now you are learning to live from clarity. That is a completely different assignment, and it will change what you notice around you. Some relationships may become easier because you are no longer bringing old pressure into them. Some relationships may become more distant because the connection depended on your old pattern. Some opportunities may become clearer because you are no longer trying to make all of them work. Some ambitions may become quieter because they belonged to an identity built around proving something. Do not panic when the rearrangement continues. Alignment has consequences. When you stop performing an old role, systems built around that role have to adjust. The person who benefited from your lack of boundaries may call your boundaries selfish. The person who relied on your constant rescue may call your peace cold. The environment that rewarded overwork may interpret rest as reduced commitment. The relationship that survived through confusion may struggle when you begin asking clear questions. Their reaction does not automatically make you right, but their discomfort does not automatically make you wrong either. Examine the pattern, not merely the reaction. This is where your discernment becomes less dependent on immediate social feedback. You listen, you reflect, you correct yourself when correction is needed. But you do not abandon growth simply because growth changes the arrangement. A cycle breaker has to tolerate some misunderstanding. Otherwise, every inherited pattern receives veto power through other people's discomfort. That is how generations repeat what nobody consciously chooses. Chosen one, remember the threshold. You did not come this far merely to identify it. You came to become someone who can cross it without dragging every old contract behind you. Recognize what is happening. Remain when the old impulse returns. Receive what can stand in truth. That is the sequence. And if something cannot survive that sequence, let that fact teach you. You do not need to punish it. You do not need to dramatize it. You do not need to turn every ending into warfare. Sometimes clarity itself is enough. Sometimes silence is enough. Sometimes a simple no is enough. Sometimes the strongest declaration is no longer participating. The new identity does not need every boundary to become a battle. That is one of the clearest signs of healing. You no longer need to destroy what you have outgrown. You can simply stop building your life around it. And that is where the once-in-a-lifetime moment begins expanding into an entirely different life. Not through one spectacular event, through a series of decisions that stop giving the old territory control over the new one. The breakthrough is no longer coming only toward you. It is beginning to happen through the way you respond. Carry that into the next movement. Because once you stop reacting from the old map, something else happens. The silence changes again. The quiet that once felt like delay begins to feel like completion. What used to feel empty begins to feel spacious. And what you thought you needed to fight begins to lose importance, simply because you are no longer feeding it your attention. Chosen one, the next stage is not another battle. It is consolidation. It is learning what must remain behind without hatred. It is learning what peace sounds like after the warning has done its work. It is learning how a decision made in one moment can become a pattern that your future no longer has to recover from. Recognize, remain, receive, then live as though the lesson was real. Chosen one, after a warning has done its work, silence no longer means what it meant before. At the beginning of this message, quiet felt uncertain because you did not know whether something was ending or whether nothing was happening at all. Now, the same quiet can carry a different weight. It can sound like completion. There comes a point when you no longer need another argument with the past. You no longer need every person to admit what they did. You no longer need every unanswered question to become a confession, an explanation, or an apology. Some chapters close because your need to reopen them finally disappears. That is not indifference. It is detachment with understanding. You can remember without returning. You can acknowledge what hurt without making the wound the center of every new decision. You can recognize that something mattered deeply without believing that its importance gives it permanent access to your future. And here is the first micro hook of this movement. What if the final sign that a cycle is ending is not that the past becomes silent, but that you no longer need to answer when it speaks? That changes the meaning of power. You once thought power meant having the perfect response. You wanted to explain yourself so clearly that nobody could misrepresent you again. You wanted enough evidence to prove what happened, enough language to make people understand, enough strength to win the argument that never seemed to end. But some arguments survive because they keep receiving your attention. Some connections remain alive because you continue carrying both sides of them in your mind. Some wounds stay central because every new experience is forced to pass through the courtroom of what happened before. Chosen one, you do not have to destroy the courtroom. You can simply stop attending every hearing. That is one of the quietest forms of liberation. You may still remember the facts. You may still know exactly what was unfair. You may still feel sadness when certain memories rise. But the memory no longer automatically becomes today's decision. That is the difference. A healed pattern does not always vanish from memory. It loses authority. The name can appear, and your entire day does not change. The old fear can rise, and you do not rearrange your future around it. The familiar urge to prove yourself can return, and you let it pass without building a performance. This is what consolidation looks like. The revelation becomes behavior. The behavior becomes repetition. The repetition becomes a new internal normal. And eventually the thing that once required enormous strength becomes something you simply no longer do. You stop chasing clarity from people committed to confusion. You stop explaining boundaries to people who only understand access. You stop asking expired situations to confirm your value. You stop reopening doors that already showed you what was behind them. That is not bitterness. That is completed learning. Cycle breaker. This matters beyond one relationship or one opportunity. Patterns move through generations because they become normal before anyone questions them. A family can call anxiety responsibility, It can call silence maturity. It can call emotional distance strength. It can call exhaustion loyalty. Then someone appears who begins asking whether survival and health are actually the same thing. That person can feel disruptive even when they are becoming more peaceful. You may be that person, not because you are above the people who came before you, because you have reached a point where repetition is no longer invisible. Once a pattern is visible, continuing it becomes a decision in a different way. This is why the once-in-a-lifetime moment can have consequences far beyond the moment itself. One boundary can become the first boundary your future children never have to apologize for. One refusal to normalize chaos can change what love feels like inside a home. One decision not to abandon yourself for approval can alter the kind of relationships you accept for years. One choice to stop worshipping exhaustion can change what achievement means in the next generation. That is how legacy begins, not always through something public, often through one private decision that nobody applauds. And this is the second microhook. What if the decision that feels small today is the first decision someone after you will never have to make? Think about that carefully. A cycle breaker does not only remove something. A cycle breaker creates a new default. If you stop confusing love with unpredictability, someone after you may grow up expecting consistency. If you stop treating overwork as proof of worth, someone after you may learn that rest and responsibility can exist together. If you stop rewarding manipulation with access, someone after you may recognize respect as normal instead of rare. That is generational change in practical form. It does not need dramatic language to become sacred. Sometimes the most spiritual thing you can do is stop handing pain a family name and calling it tradition, chosen one. This is also why you do not need hatred in order to break a pattern. Hatred can keep you emotionally tied to what you claim to be leaving. You can release something without rewriting the entire past as evil. You can understand that people acted from their own wounds without giving those wounds permission to keep injuring you. You can forgive in your heart without restoring access where trust has not been rebuilt. You can pray for someone and still maintain distance. Compassion and boundaries can occupy the same room. That balance is important because one of the ways the old map returns is through false guilt. It whispers that if you are truly healed, you should allow everything back. It tells you that peace requires reopening every connection. It tells you that forgiveness must erase consequences. But forgiveness and access are not the same decision. One happens inside you. The other depends on reality, character, trust, and what has actually changed. A person can be forgiven and still remain outside a boundary. A situation can be released and still remain unsuitable for your future. A chapter can be honored and still stay closed. That is not contradiction. That is wisdom. Chosen one. Pay attention to how much energy becomes available when you stop trying to force old things into new meanings. You do not have to turn every betrayal into a hidden blessing. You do not have to pretend every loss felt good because you learned from it. You can simply say that it happened. It changed you. You learned what was yours to learn, and it no longer gets to design the next chapter. That simplicity is powerful. The mind spends enormous energy fighting reality when reality has already happened. What if they had chosen differently? What if you had spoken earlier? What if you had seen the patterns sooner? What if you had left faster? What if you had stayed longer? There is a place for honest reflection, but reflection becomes a trap when the purpose is no longer learning and the only goal is to create a past that never existed. You cannot edit yesterday into safety. You can use yesterday to make today clearer. That is enough. The spiritual warrior in you needs to learn this, because not every battle deserves a final battle. Some battles end when you stop appearing. Some enemies lose power when there is no longer a reaction to feed. Some patterns collapse when they cannot recruit your attention. You do not have to announce every exit. You do not have to make every boundary poetic. You do not have to prove that you have moved on. Sometimes moving on is proved by the absence of performance, and that can feel strange if your old survival strategy depended on being understood. The quieter your healing becomes, the less material it gives the old pattern to argue with. This does not mean silence in situations where truth, safety, or responsibility requires speech. It means you stop using explanation as a way to beg for permission to protect yourself. You speak when speaking serves truth. You remain silent when silence protects clarity. The difference is intention. A watchman is not mute. A watchman is selective. The gate does not open every time someone knocks loudly. That is stewardship. There is another change that often appears during consolidation. You begin noticing that certain desires lose intensity once they are no longer connected to a wound. You may still want love, but you no longer want to be chosen by anyone at any cost. You may still want success, but you no longer want success mainly to prove that people underestimated you. You may still want abundance, but you no longer need money to function as revenge. You may still want recognition, but you no longer want recognition badly enough to become whatever the room rewards. That is not losing ambition. It is purification of motive. And purified desire behaves differently. It can wait without collapsing. It can receive without worshipping. It can release without believing the future is over. This is the third micro hook. What if the reason some old dream feels quieter now is not because you stopped believing, but because you no longer need the dream to heal a wound it was never designed to heal? That can be difficult to accept. Maybe you built a goal around being seen by someone who never saw you. Maybe you imagined success as the moment everyone who dismissed you would finally regret it. Maybe you imagined love as proof that rejection had been defeated. Maybe you imagined wealth as protection from every feeling of insecurity. Those desires can contain something real, while also carrying an old wound inside them. When the wound begins losing authority, the desire changes shape. You may still pursue the goal, but you pursue it differently. There is less poison in the fuel. You do not have to exhaust yourself proving a point to people who are no longer watching. You do not have to turn every achievement into evidence for a courtroom that should have closed years ago. You can build because building matters. You can love because love matters. You can create because something in you is alive. You can prosper without needing someone else to feel defeated. That is freedom from comparison. And freedom from comparison creates a different kind of peace. The old world required witnesses. The new world can exist even when nobody is impressed yet. That is one reason the next season may feel less dramatic and more stable. Stability can look unimpressive from the outside. No emergency. No sudden reconciliation followed by another collapse. No cycle of extreme hope and extreme disappointment. No constant need to guess where you stand. Just consistency. For someone trained by instability, consistency may initially feel empty, but give it time. What feels empty may simply be a life without unnecessary adrenaline. Peace has a texture that chaos trained you not to recognize. This is why you have to let the nervous system learn the new environment. Do not fill every quiet evening with a problem. Do not create conflict because connection feels too calm. Do not spend money simply because Having money creates an unfamiliar sense of safety. Do not sabotage a routine because stability feels like stagnation. Not every plateau is a warning. Some plateaus are where roots strengthen, and this time you do not need to make everything happen faster. You already learned that speed and alignment are different things. Let what is healthy become familiar. This is where readiness becomes less mystical and more practical. Readiness means you can remain present when something good does not immediately become dramatic. Readiness means you can carry responsibility without turning it into self-punishment. Readiness means you can receive a compliment without dismissing it or becoming dependent on the next one. Readiness means you can rest without constructing a moral argument against yourself. Readiness means you can say no without spending 3 days trying to convince yourself that you are still a good person. That is mature authority. Chosen one, notice how different this is from the version of strength you may have celebrated before. Old strength said, "I can survive anything." New strength says, "I do not need to enter everything simply to prove I can survive it." Old strength said, "I can carry everyone." New strength says, "I know what is mine to carry." Old strength said, "I can work until I collapse." New strength says, "My assignment needs a body and mind capable of continuing." That is not less strength. It is strength under governance. The watchman does not abandon the tower because the night is quiet. The watchman also does not sound the alarm every time a branch moves. Discernment includes knowing when no emergency exists. That can be revolutionary for a person whose body has lived as though danger is always near. The quiet after the warning can become evidence that the warning succeeded. You saw what needed to be seen. You made what needed to be made visible. You do not need another crisis to validate the lesson. And here is the fourth micro hook. What if the next proof of growth is not another breakthrough, but your ability to stop asking life to test a lesson you have already learned? You do not need another betrayal to prove your boundaries are stronger. You do not need another financial collapse to prove you have learned stewardship. You do not need another toxic connection to prove your discernment works. You do not need another season of burnout to prove you understand the cost of overwork. At some point, wisdom should be allowed to remain wisdom without another wound, making it memorable. That is what consolidation protects. It protects lessons from being forgotten when the pain that taught them fades. Because pain can make a lesson vivid. Peace can make the lesson easier to neglect. That is why you build practices around what you know. You protect time to think. You notice what environments scatter you. You remain aware of the people who consistently bring clarity versus confusion. You watch the relationship between fatigue and poor decisions. You keep your boundaries visible enough that exhaustion cannot negotiate them away. You support your attention in practical ways. You do not wait until crisis to remember what matters. This is how insight becomes structure. And structure is one of the ways a future is protected. You do not need perfect discipline. You need enough consistency that your values remain accessible when emotion becomes loud. That is preparation after the revelation. Chosen one, there may also be grief here. Do not mistake peace for a requirement to feel nothing. Sometimes you become clear enough to release something and then grieve it more honestly than you ever could while you were still fighting to keep it. You can know a door should remain closed and still miss what you hoped would be behind it. You can know a relationship was unhealthy and still grieve the good parts. You can know an old dream no longer fits and still mourn the person who carried it for years. Grief does not cancel discernment. Sometimes grief is what happens when discernment stops bargaining. Let yourself feel what is real without turning the feeling into a command to go backward. Sadness can honor what mattered. It does not have to reopen what ended. Tears can exist inside certainty. Love can remain after access ends. That complexity is human. Maturity can hold it. The chosen one identity should never require you to become emotionally numb. Sensitivity is not the enemy. Unexamined reaction is the risk. Feel deeply and choose clearly. That combination is stronger than hardness, and it is more sustainable than constant warfare. Chosen one. Another rearrangement may happen quietly around you. People who are comfortable with the old version of you may not know how to relate to the new one. Some will adjust. Some will become curious. Some will respect the shift. Others may attempt to restore the old arrangement because the old arrangement benefited them. You do not need to label every resistance as evil. Systems naturally react when one part changes. Your job is to observe what the reaction reveals. Does someone respond to your boundary with dialogue or punishment? Does someone respect a no or try to exhaust you until it becomes yes? Does someone celebrate your growth or only your usefulness? Does someone want relationship with you or access to the role you used to perform? These questions become easier when you stop rushing to interpret every reaction. Let patterns speak through repetition. That is what discernment looks like after urgency loses its throne. You no longer need one dramatic event to tell you everything. You watch consistency. This applies to opportunities too. An opportunity that belongs in your life should become clearer as you examine its reality. What is actually required? What are the costs? What are the people involved like over time? Does the promise match the structure? Does the structure respect your values? Do not let excitement exempt anything from examination, but do not let fear disqualify everything before examination begins. That balance is the new map. Open, but not careless. Hopeful, but not blind. Sensitive, but not ruled by every feeling. Strong, but not permanently armored. This is what readiness looks like after a long formation season. And now, the silence becomes useful. You can hear what belongs, because fewer old voices are competing for authority. You can recognize the difference between desire and desperation. You can feel longing without converting longing into prophecy. You can want an answer while still living responsibly before the answer arrives. That may seem ordinary. It is not. For someone who once organized their entire emotional life around uncertainty, it is a profound form of freedom. The future stops being a rescue mission. It becomes a place you are capable of meeting. Chosen one, this is the fifth micro-hook, and it prepares the final movement. What if the sacred seal at the end is not about convincing heaven to give you something, but about declaring that the old pattern no longer receives permission to decide who you become next? That changes the purpose of declaration. You are not begging for identity. You are affirming responsibility. You are not pretending fear does not exist. You are declaring that fear does not rule. You are not denying the past. You are deciding what the past is allowed to teach without allowing it to govern. That is what will be sealed. Before we reach that final movement, let the rearrangement settle. You do not need to solve everything tonight. You do not need to know the name of every future door. You do not need a calendar for every promise. You do not need to manufacture certainty. The warning has already given you something more useful, a way to recognize yourself at the threshold, a way to see whether the old map is speaking, a way to distinguish pressure from clarity, a way to notice whether the opening requires you to betray the person you have become. That is enough for the next decision, and sometimes the next decision is all you are responsible for. One honest response. One boundary maintained. One apology given where you truly owe one. One invitation examined. One old conversation left untouched. One night of rest instead of another hour of anxious analysis. A future is built through moments like these. That is why the once-in-a-lifetime moment does not end when the dramatic insight ends. Its meaning spreads through the decisions that follow. The threshold becomes a path. The path becomes a pattern. The pattern becomes a legacy. This is how a cycle breaker moves from private healing into generational consequence. You stop handing forward what you were handed simply because it was familiar. You keep the courage. You keep the resilience. You keep the sensitivity. You keep the ability to survive. But you do not require the next generation to suffer in the same ways in order to earn the same wisdom. That is a holy form of progress. The wilderness can teach you without becoming your permanent home. The battle can strengthen you without becoming your permanent identity. The delay can prepare you without becoming the lens through which you interpret every future pause. The wound can deepen your compassion without becoming the center of your personality. You are allowed to carry the lesson more lightly than you carried the event. That is part of healing too. Chosen one, the room is quieter now. Let it be quiet. You do not have to fill it with another warning. You do not have to search for another enemy. You do not have to reopen every question we just closed. The silence can finally become space. Space to choose. Space to receive. Space to think. Space to pray without panic. Space to notice the difference between what calls your name and what actually belongs to your assignment. And in that space, something becomes clear. The great shift was never only that a door might open. The great shift was that you became less willing to abandon yourself in order to walk through one. That is why the person standing here is different from the person who began this message. You are not listening only for a prophecy now. You are listening for alignment. You are not asking only what is coming. You are asking what kind of person can carry what comes without rebuilding the old cycle around it. That question is wiser. And wisdom is one of the clearest signs that the formation season has not been wasted. We are almost at the final seal. When we enter it, do not treat the words as magic. Do not treat a declaration as a transaction. Let the final movement become a conscious agreement with the identity and responsibility you have spent this message recognizing. The prayer will not ask you to become someone unreal. It will ask you to stop surrendering authority to what has already completed its lesson. Chosen one, let the past become teacher instead of master. Let silence become space instead of threat. Let peace become information instead of suspicion. Let boundaries become stewardship instead of punishment. Let desire become clean enough that it does not need desperation to survive. And let the threshold become the place where the cycle finally loses its claim on the future. You do not need another battle before you are allowed to enter peace. You do not need another betrayal before you are allowed to trust your discernment. You do not need another collapse before you are allowed to change how you build. The lesson is already here. The recognition is already here. Now what remains is to seal what you know without returning to the person who needed pain to make truth feel real. Chosen one, we have reached the final movement, and the tone changes here. There is nothing left to chase, nothing left to force, and nothing left to prove before this message can be complete. The warning has already done its work by showing you the threshold, the old map, the receiver, the pattern, and the decision that follows recognition. So before any declaration, allow yourself one quiet breath. Not because a breath is magical, not because calmness creates destiny, but because, after so much internal movement, stillness gives truth room to settle. You do not need to manufacture emotion for this moment to matter. You do not need tears. You do not need chills. You do not need a dramatic sign. You only need enough honesty to recognize what you are no longer willing to hand authority back to. That is the first micro-hook of this final movement. What if the seal is not about asking God to make you someone new? What if it is about agreeing that the person formed through the last season is finally allowed to lead? That changes everything. You began this message as the chosen one, listening for a warning. You moved through it as the spiritual warrior, learning that not every quiet place is a battlefield. You became the watchman, learning to distinguish pressure from permission, urgency from alignment, and intensity from truth. You became the cycle breaker, willing to see that inherited patterns can survive even after the original danger is gone. And now, the identity moves one step deeper. Destiny carrier. Not because the name makes you superior, because carrying something meaningful requires responsibility. It requires the ability to hold peace without sabotaging it. It requires the ability to receive opportunity without worshipping it. It requires the ability to recognize an old pattern without becoming the old pattern. Identity becomes real when it changes what you do next. So, let the release begin there. Release the need to prove that the people who misunderstood you were wrong. Release the fantasy that one future achievement will finally rewrite every moment when you felt unseen. Release the need for someone from your past to return with the perfect explanation before you allow yourself to move forward. Release the belief that closure must always be handed to you by the person who created the confusion. Some closure comes from understanding enough. Some closure comes from accepting what repeatedly happened. Some closure comes from recognizing that another conversation would only create another loop. Not every open question deserves permanent residence in your mind. Release the habit of calling anxiety discernment simply because anxiety speaks quickly. Release the habit of calling exhaustion purpose because you learn to associate struggle with worth. Release the habit of calling emotional distance strength simply because needing no one once helped you survive. Release the belief that every good thing must come with a hidden punishment. You are allowed to examine a blessing without preparing immediately for its disappearance. You are allowed to experience consistency without searching underneath it for chaos. You are allowed to receive kindness without creating debt in your own mind. You are allowed to let peace remain peace. And now, the second micro hook. There may be one thing you have not considered yet. What if the final thing you need to release is not a person, a memory, or a fear? What if it is the identity of being the one who is always recovering? Listen carefully. Recovery can become familiar. Healing can become a permanent project. You can become so accustomed to explaining who you are through what you survived that a life no longer centered on survival feels difficult to describe. But the spiritual warrior was never created to live forever inside war. The cycle breaker was never meant to spend the rest of life staring at the cycle that was broken. The watchman was never meant to sound an alarm simply to prove that the tower still matters. There comes a point when strength has to learn how to build. There comes a point when discernment has to learn how to trust wisely. There comes a point when healing has to make room for living. You do not betray your past by no longer organizing your future around it. So say this inwardly in your own way. I honor what I survived. I honor what I learned. I honor the version of me that found a way through conditions I did not always understand. But I do not require pain to remain my teacher forever. I do not require rejection to remind me of my worth. I do not require chaos to prove that my discernment is awake. I do not require exhaustion to prove that my work matters. I can carry the lesson without carrying the wound as my identity. Let that settle. You do not need to erase memory. You are changing its position. Memory can become counsel instead of command. Pain can become context instead of identity. Experience can become wisdom instead of a prison. That is what integration looks like. It is not forgetting. It is remembering without surrendering the present. Chosen one, there is also something you need to stop asking from yourself. Stop demanding perfect certainty before every courageous step. You were never promised a life without unknowns. Discernment is not the elimination of uncertainty. It is the ability to move with integrity while uncertainty still exists. Courage begins where absolute certainty ends. That does not mean reckless action. It means you can examine facts, listen carefully, pray, reflect, seek wise counsel, and still reach a point where another week of analysis will not create more truth. Sometimes another week only creates more delay, and sometimes delay is no longer divine timing. Sometimes it is an old defense trying to avoid vulnerability. You already know how to tell the difference more clearly now. One expands clarity. The other multiplies compulsion. One can tolerate examination. The other demands endless reassurance. One leaves you grounded even when the answer is difficult. The other keeps moving the standard for certainty every time certainty gets close. Watch the pattern. And now, the third micro hook. What if the once-in-a-lifetime moment has already begun? Not as one external event you need to identify tomorrow, but as the internal refusal to keep making the same decision from the same wound. That is where the title becomes personal. The moment may already be happening in the fact that you can hear an old fear without immediately obeying it. It may already be happening because the person who once controlled your emotional state no longer controls the rhythm of your day. It may already be happening because you can imagine an opportunity arriving without immediately believing you must seize it before it disappears. It may already be happening because you are no longer willing to purchase belonging with self-abandonment. A threshold can begin internally before the external evidence catches up. That is why the seal cannot be about chasing a future event. The seal is about how you stand now. So, if it helps you focus, place a hand over your heart for a moment, not as superstition, not as a transaction, simply as a physical reminder that the declaration you are about to make belongs to your own responsibility. Then, listen. I release the version of myself that confuses urgency with importance. I release the version of myself that believes every silence means abandonment. I release the version of myself that believes love must be unstable to be real. I release the version of myself that believes rest must be earned through collapse. I release the version of myself that believes saying no makes me unkind. I release the version of myself that believes being needed is the same as being valued. I release the need to return to what hurt me simply because it is familiar. I choose clarity over compulsion. I choose truth over performance. I choose consistency over emotional chaos. I choose boundaries that protect honest connection rather than walls that prevent connection entirely. I choose patience when patience creates wisdom. I choose movement when delay has become fear. I choose to examine opportunities without worshipping them. I choose to receive love without abandoning discernment. I choose to let the old map become history instead of law. Chosen one, This is not a declaration that you will never make another mistake. Do not place that burden on yourself. You will still misread things sometimes. You will still have days when old reactions return. You will still feel fear in situations where you wish you felt peace. That does not erase the work. A new identity is not proven by never hearing the old voice again. It is proven by increasingly refusing to let that voice make the final decision. Progress is not perfection. Authority is choice repeated. This is how the new normal becomes real. One pause before reacting. One honest question before assuming. One night of rest before making a decision from exhaustion. One boundary held without unnecessary explanation. One healthy invitation allowed to remain healthy without testing it into chaos. One opportunity examined without desperation. One memory felt without turning it into an instruction to go backward. These decisions may look small. Together, they redraw a life. And eventually, they redraw a legacy. Cycle breaker. Think beyond yourself for a moment. Someone after you may inherit the peace you practiced before they ever understand what it cost you to learn it. They may grow up believing that love can be consistent. They may grow up believing that disagreement does not require emotional abandonment. They may grow up believing that rest belongs inside a responsible life. They may learn that asking for help does not remove dignity. They may learn that a boundary can exist without hatred. Your private healing can become someone else's normal. That is the fourth micro hook. What if the greatest evidence that you broke the cycle is that someone after you never learns to call the old pattern normal? There is something sacred about that. Not glamorous, not loud, sacred. The pain stops being inherited as identity. The lesson remains, but the wound does not have to be recreated to teach it. You can become the point where survival wisdom evolves into healthy wisdom. You keep resilience. You release hypervigilance. You keep discipline. You release self-punishment. You keep sensitivity. You release the belief that every feeling is instruction. You keep strength without making hardness your personality. That is legacy. And now, chosen one, bring the warning back to its simplest form. There will be doors. There will be opportunities. There will be returns. There will be endings. There will be moments when the old pattern speaks before the new identity has finished taking its first breath. You do not need to fear those moments. You have a process now. Recognize, remain, receive. Recognize what is happening. Remain long enough for clarity to separate itself from compulsion. Receive only what can survive truth. Let that process become your protection. You do not need paranoia. You need presence. You do not need to search everywhere for hidden enemies. You need to notice what happens inside you when something touches an old wound. You do not need every answer tonight. You need enough alignment for the next honest decision. That is much lighter to carry, and it is much more useful. There is one last practical thing to say before the seal becomes completely quiet. The resource mentioned earlier remains available through the official access point in the description and pinned comment if you decide you want to explore support for focus and mental clarity. The decision is yours, and the resource is not a requirement for faith, identity, or spiritual alignment. Let it remain what it is, a practical option, not an authority over your life. Now leave the sales question there. Return to the sacred center. The sacred center is not a product. It is responsibility. It is discernment. It is the agreement that you will no longer ask an old wound to interpret every new door. That is the seal. So let the final declaration be simple. I am not returning to confusion simply because confusion is familiar. I am not reopening a completed cycle simply because loneliness makes the silence uncomfortable. I am not calling pressure divine simply because I am afraid of missing out. I am not rejecting peace simply because peace does not resemble the intensity I learned to associate with love, purpose, or breakthrough. I will examine what comes. I will stay honest about what I see. I will allow time, character, and reality to participate in discernment. I will not abandon myself in order to be chosen. I will not abandon wisdom in order to move quickly. I will not abandon compassion in order to feel powerful. I will not abandon boundaries in order to appear forgiving. I will not abandon rest in order to feel worthy. I will carry what is mine. I will release what is not. I will learn from the past without rebuilding it. I will let the next season teach me something new. Chosen one, the fifth and final microhook is not another mystery. It is a question you will carry after the video ends. When the next door appears, which version of you will answer? That is the only question that needs to remain open. Not because you do not know enough, because your answer will be given through behavior. The old version may speak first. Let it speak. You do not have to hate it. You do not have to silence it violently. You only have to remember that it no longer holds the final vote. The chosen one listens. The watchman examines. The spiritual warrior remains steady. The cycle breaker refuses automatic repetition. The destiny carrier chooses according to the territory ahead rather than the territory behind. That is identity in motion. And when you forget, return to the simplest truth from this entire message. The door is not the whole story. The person standing before the door matters. You matter. Your condition matters. Your attention matters. Your boundaries matter. Your ability to recognize old fear without surrendering to it matters. Your willingness to receive without grabbing matters. Your willingness to release without hatred matters. Your response becomes part of the future you asked for. So you do not need another warning tonight. You do not need another countdown. You do not need another prophecy promising that everything changes by a certain hour. Let the message end more quietly than it began, because now the quiet means something different. At the beginning, quiet felt like uncertainty. Now, it can feel like authority. At the beginning, you wondered whether nothing was happening. Now you know that some of the deepest movement happens when an old pattern loses the ability to create the same response. That is movement too. Let the room become still. Let the old names become quiet. Let the unfinished arguments remain unfinished if finishing them would require returning to a cycle already understood. Let the future stay partly unknown. You do not need to possess the entire map before taking the next honest step. God can remain God without giving you every detail in advance. You can remain responsible without controlling every outcome. Faith and wisdom can walk together. Chosen one, may you recognize the difference between peace and avoidance. May you recognize the difference between caution and fear. May you recognize the difference between desire and desperation. May you recognize the difference between forgiveness and renewed access. May you recognize the difference between a door that flatters the old identity and a door that can be entered without betraying the new one. May your sensitivity become discernment rather than exhaustion. May your strength become stewardship rather than permanent battle. May your independence become choice rather than isolation. May your past become wisdom rather than a prophecy of repetition. And may the generations after you inherit more peace than fear. May they inherit boundaries without shame. May they inherit ambition without self-destruction. May they inherit love without confusion. May they inherit faith without panic. May they inherit strength without believing pain is required to earn it. That is a legacy worth carrying. That is a cycle worth breaking. That is a future worth entering awake. So when the next moment comes, do not ask first whether it looks spectacular. Ask whether you can remain truthful inside it. Ask whether peace survives examination. Ask whether your integrity has to shrink in order to enter. Ask whether the old wound is choosing or whether the person formed through the waiting season is finally leading. Then make the next honest decision. You do not have to make every future decision tonight. Only the next one when it arrives. That is enough. Chosen one, the warning has been delivered. The loop has closed. The old map has been named. The threshold has been recognized. And now there is nothing left to force. Go forward without needing chaos to confirm that you are moving. Go forward without needing every person to understand. Go forward without turning every unfamiliar feeling into a warning. Go forward awake, grounded, observant, and willing to correct your course when truth requires it. Go forward as someone who no longer needs the wilderness to prove that God is present. The moment only comes once, because this version of you will never stand at this exact threshold again. After the next choice, you will know something you did not know before. You will carry an experience you did not carry before. You will become responsible for another layer of truth. That is how life moves. That is how identity becomes history. That is how one decision becomes a path. And that is how a path becomes a legacy. Chosen one, be at peace. You do not need to chase the moment. When it comes, recognize, remain, receive, and let the person God has been